Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. She was the youngest of the 2 daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess. 16 years had Miss Taylor been in Mr. Woodhouse's family. The shadow of authority being now long passed away, they had been living together as friend and friend very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. The real evils, indeed, of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way, and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. Sorrow came. Miss Taylor married. It was Miss Taylor's loss which first brought grief. It was on the wedding day of this beloved friend that Emma first sat in mournful thought of any continuance. The wedding over, and the bride people gone, her father and herself were left to dine together, with no prospect of a third to cheer a long evening. The event had every promise of happiness for her friend, but how was she to bear the change? It was true that her friend was going only half a mile from them, but Emma was aware that great must be the difference between a Mrs. Weston only half a mile from them and a Miss Taylor in the house, and with her advantages, natural and domestic, she was now in great danger of suffering from intellectual solitude. She dearly loved her father, but he was no companion for her. He could not meet her in conversation, rational or playful. Her sister, being settled in London, 16 miles off, was much beyond her daily reach, and many a long evening must be struggled through before Christmas brought the next visit from Isabella and her husband and their little children to fill the house and give her pleasant society again. Highbury, the large and populous village to which Hartfield belonged, afforded her no equals. She had many acquaintance in the place, but not one among them who could be accepted in lieu of Miss Taylor. It was a melancholy change, and Emma could not but sigh over it and wish for impossible things, till her father awoke and made it necessary to be cheerful. He was a nervous man, easily depressed, fond of everybody that he was used to, and hating to part with them, hating change of every kind. Matrimony, as the origin of change, was always disagreeable, and he was by no means yet reconciled to his own daughter's marrying, when he was now obliged to part with Miss Taylor too, and from his habits of gentle selfishness, and of being never able to suppose that other people could feel differently from himself, he was very much disposed to think Miss Taylor had done as sad a thing for herself as for them, and would have been a great deal happier if she had spent all the rest of her life at Hartfield. Emma smiled and chatted as cheerfully as she could to keep him from such thoughts, but when tea came, it was impossible for him not to say exactly as he had done at dinner.
Poor Miss Taylor. I wish she were here again. What a pity it is that Mr. Weston ever thought of her.
Emma hoped, by the help of backgammon, to get her father tolerably through the evening, and be attacked by no regrets but her own. The backgammon table was placed, but a visitor immediately afterwards walked in and made it unnecessary. Mr. Knightley, a sensible man, about 7 or 8 and 30, was not only a very old and intimate friend of the family, but particularly connected with it as the elder brother of Isabella's husband. He lived about a mile from Highbury, was a frequent visitor, and always welcome, and at this time more welcome than usual, as coming directly from their mutual connections in London. It was a happy circumstance, and animated Mr. Woodhouse for some time. Mr. Knightley had a cheerful manner, which always did him good. Mr. Woodhouse gratefully observed,
"It is very kind of you, Mr. Knightley, to come out at this late hour to call upon us. I am afraid you must have had a shocking walk."
"Not at all, sir. It is a beautiful moonlight night, and so mild that I must draw back from your great fire."
"Well, that is quite surprising, for we have had a vast deal of rain here. It rained dreadfully hard for half an hour while we were at breakfast. I wanted them to put off the wedding, Poor Miss Taylor. 'Tis a sad business.
Well, said Emma, you want to hear about the wedding, and I shall be happy to tell you, for we all behaved charmingly. Not a tear, and hardly a long face to be seen. Oh, no, we all felt that we were going to be only half a mile apart, and were sure of meeting every day.
Oh, dear, Emma bears everything so well, said her father. But Mr. Knightley, she is really very sorry to lose poor Miss Taylor, and I'm sure she will miss her more than she thinks for.
Emma turned away her head, divided between tears and smiles.
But, said Mr. Knightley, every friend of Miss Taylor must be glad to have her so happily married.
And you have forgotten one matter of joy to me, said Emma, and a very considerable one, that I made the match myself.
Mr. Knightley shook his head at her. Her father fondly replied, Ah, my dear, I wish you would not make matches and foretell things, for whatever you say always comes to pass. Pray do not make any more matches.
I promise you to make none for myself, Papa, but I must indeed for other people. It is the greatest amusement in the world, and after such success, you know, ever since the day that Miss Taylor and I met Mr. Weston in Broadway Lane, when, because it began to mizzle, he darted away and borrowed 2 umbrellas for us, I made up my mind on the subject. I planned the match from that hour, and when such success has blessed me in this instance, dear Papa, you cannot think that I shall leave off matchmaking.
I do not understand what you mean by success, said Mr. Knightley. Success supposes endeavour. Your time has been properly and delicately spent if you have been endeavouring for the last 4 years to bring about this marriage, a worthy employment for a young lady's mind. But if, which I rather imagine, your making the match, as you call it, means only your planning it, you're saying to yourself one idle day, I think it would be a very good thing for Miss Taylor if Mr. Weston were to marry her, and saying it again to yourself every now and then afterwards, why do you talk of success? Where is your merit? What are you proud of? You made a lucky guess, and that is all that can be said. A straightforward, open-hearted man like Weston and a rational, unaffected woman like Miss Taylor may be left safely to manage their own concerns. You are more likely to have done harm to yourself than good to them by interference. Emma never thinks of herself if she can do good to others, rejoined Mr. Woodhouse, understanding but in part. But, my dear, pray do not make any more matches. They are silly things, and break up one's family circle grievously.
Only one more, Papa, only for Mr. Elton. I thought when he was joining their hands today, he looked so very much as if he would like to have the same kind of office done for him.
Mr. Elton is a very pretty young man, to be sure, and a very good young man, and I have great regard for him. But if you want to show him any attention, my dear, ask him to come and dine with us some day. That will be a much better thing. I dare say Mr. Knightley will be so kind as to meet him.
With a great deal of pleasure, sir, at any time. And I agree with you entirely that it will be a much better thing. Invite him to dinner, Emma, and help him to the best of the fish and the chicken, but leave him to choose his own wife. Depend upon it, a man of 6 or 7 and 20 can take care of himself. Mr. Weston was a native of Highbury, and born of a respectable family. As a young man, he had entered the militia, and when the chances of his military life had introduced him to Miss Churchill, of a great Yorkshire family, and Miss Churchill fell in love with him, nobody was surprised except her brother and his wife, who had never seen him, and were full of pride and importance, which the connection would offend. But Captain Weston, who had been considered, especially by the Churchills, as making such an amazing match, was proved to have much the worst of the bargain. For when his wife died, after 3 years' marriage, he was rather a poorer man than at first, and with a child to maintain. From the expense of the child, however, he was soon relieved, and Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, having no children of their own, offered to take the whole charge of the little Frank soon after her decease. Some scruples and some reluctance the widower father may be supposed to have felt, but as they were overcome by other considerations, the child was given up to the care and the wealth of the Churchills, and he had only his own comfort to seek, and his own situation to improve as he could. He quitted the militia and engaged in trade, having brothers already established in a good way in London, which afforded him a favourable opening. He made his fortune, bought his house, and obtained a wife, and was beginning a new period of existence, with every probability of greater happiness than in any yet passed through. He had never been an unhappy man. His own temper had secured him from that, even in his first marriage, but his second must show him how delightful a well-judging and truly amiable woman could be, and must give him the pleasantest proof of its being a great deal better to choose than to be chosen, to excite gratitude than to feel it. He had only himself to please in his choice. His fortune was his own, for as to Frank, it was more than being tacitly brought up as his uncle's heir. It had become so avowed an adoption as to have him assume the name of Churchill on coming of age. Mr. Weston saw his son every year in London and was proud of him, and his fond report of him as a very fine young man had made Highbury feel a sort of pride in him too. He was looked on as sufficiently belonging to the place to make his merits and prospects a kind of common concern. Mr. Frank Churchill was one of the boasts of Highbury, and a lively curiosity to see him prevailed, though the compliment was so little returned that he had never been there in his life. His coming to visit his father had been often talked of, but never achieved. Now, upon his father's marriage, it was very generally proposed as a most proper attention that the visit should take place. Now was the time for Mr. Frank Churchill to come among them, and the hope strengthened when it was understood that he had written to his new mother on the occasion. It was indeed a highly prized letter. Mrs. Weston had, of course, formed a very favourable idea of the young man, and such a pleasing attention was an irresistible proof of his great good sense, and a most welcome addition to every expression of congratulation which her marriage had already secured. Her situation was altogether the subject of hours of gratitude to Mrs. Weston, and of moments only of regret, and her satisfaction, her cheerful enjoyment, was so just and so apparent that Emma, well as she knew her father, was sometimes taken by surprise at his being still able to pity poor Miss Taylor when they left her at Randalls in the centre of every domestic comfort, or saw her go away in the evening attended by her pleasant husband to a carriage of her own. But never did she go without Mr. Woodhouse's giving a gentle sigh and saying, "Ah, poor Miss Taylor, she would be very glad to stay." Mr. Woodhouse was fond of society in his own way. He liked very much to have his friends come and see him, and from various united causes, from his long residence at Hartfield and his good nature, from his fortune, his house, and his daughter, he could command the visits of his own little circle in a great measure as he liked, and unless he fancied himself at any time unequal to company, there was scarcely an evening in the week in which Emma could not make up a card table for him. Real, long-standing regard brought the Westons and Mr. Knightley, and by Mr. Elton, a young man living alone without liking it, the privilege of exchanging any vacant evening of his own blank solitude for the elegancies and society of Mr. Woodhouse's drawing-room and the smiles of his lovely daughter was in no danger of being thrown away. After these came a second set, among the most compatible of whom were Mrs. and Miss Bates and Mrs. Goddard, three ladies almost always at the service of an invitation from Hartfield, and who were fetched and carried home so often that Mr. Woodhouse thought it no hardship for either James or the horses. Had it taken place only once a year, it would have been a grievance. Mrs. Bates, the widow of a former vicar of Highbury, was a very old lady, almost past everything but tea and quadrille. She lived with her single daughter in a very small way, and was considered with all the regard and respect which a harmless old lady, under such untoward circumstances, can excite. Her daughter enjoyed a most uncommon degree of popularity for a woman neither young, handsome, rich, nor married. Yet she was a happy woman, and a woman whom no one named without goodwill. It was her own universal goodwill and contented temper which worked such wonders. She loved everybody, was interested in everybody's happiness, quick-sighted to everybody's merits, thought herself a most fortunate creature, and surrounded with blessings in such an excellent mother and so many good neighbours and friends, and a home that wanted for nothing. The simplicity and cheerfulness of her nature, her contented and grateful spirit, were a recommendation to everybody, and a mine of felicity to herself. She was a great talker upon little matters, which exactly suited Mr. Woodhouse, full of trivial communications and harmless gossip. Mrs. Goddard was the mistress of a school, a real, honest, old-fashioned boarding school, where a reasonable quantity of accomplishments were sold at a reasonable price, and where girls might be sent to be out of the way and scramble themselves into a little education without any danger of coming back prodigies. These were the ladies whom Emma found herself very frequently able to collect. 3 such women made her feel that every evening so spent was indeed one of the long evenings she had fearfully anticipated. As she sat one morning looking forward to exactly such a close of the present day, a note was brought from Mrs. Goddard, requesting, in most respectful terms, to be allowed to bring Miss Smith with her, a most welcome request. For Miss Smith was a girl of 17, whom Emma knew very well by sight, and had long felt an interest in on account of her beauty. A very gracious invitation was returned, and the evening no longer dreaded by the fair mistress of the mansion. Harriet Smith was the natural daughter of somebody. Somebody had placed her several years back at Mrs. Goddard's school, and somebody had lately raised her from the condition of scholar to that of parlour boarder. This was all that was generally known of her history. She had no visible friends but what had been acquired at Highbury, and was now just returned from a long visit in the country to see some young ladies who had been at school there with her. Emma was as much pleased with her manners as her person, and quite determined to continue the acquaintance. The friends from whom she had just parted, though very good sort of people, must be doing her harm. They were a family of the name of Martin, whom Emma knew well by character, as renting a large farm of Mr. Knightley, and residing in the parish of Donwell. Very creditably, she believed. She knew Mr. Knightley thought highly of them, but they must be coarse and unpolished, and very unfit to be the intimates of a girl who wanted only a little more knowledge and elegance to be quite perfect. She would notice her, she would improve her, she would detach her from her bad acquaintance and introduce her into good society. She would form her opinions and her manners. It would be an interesting and certainly a very kind undertaking, highly becoming her own situation in life, her leisure and powers. She was so busy in admiring those soft blue eyes, in talking and listening, and forming all these schemes in the in-betweens, that the evening flew away at a very unusual rate, and the supper table, which always closed such parties, and for which she had been used to sit and watch the due time, was all set out and ready and moved forward to the fire before she was aware. Upon such occasions, poor Mr. Woodhouse's feelings were in sad warfare. He loved to have the cloth laid, because it had been the fashion of his youth, but his conviction of suppers being very unwholesome made him rather sorry to see anything put on it. And while his hospitality would have welcomed his visitors to everything, his care for their health made him grieve that they would eat. Such another small basin of thin gruel as his own was all that he could, with thorough self-approbation, recommend, though he might constrain himself, while the ladies were comfortably clearing the nicer things, to say, "Oh, Mrs. Bates, let me propose your venturing on one of these eggs. An egg boiled very soft is not unwholesome. Searle understands boiling an egg better than anybody. I would not recommend an egg boiled by anybody else. But you need not be afraid. They are very small, you see. One of our small eggs will not hurt you. Miss Bates, let Emma help you to a little bit of tart. A very little bit. Ours are all apple tarts. You need not be afraid of unwholesome preserves here. I do not advise the custard. Mrs. Goddard, what say you to half a glass of wine? A small half glass put into a tumbler of water. I do not think it could disagree with you." Emma allowed her father to talk, but supplied her visitors in a much more satisfactory style, and on the present evening had particular pleasure in sending them away happy. Harriet Smith's intimacy at Hartfield was soon a settled thing.
"I do not know what your opinion may be, Mrs. Weston," said Mr. Knightley, "of this great intimacy between Emma and Harriet Smith, but I think it is a bad thing."
A bad thing? Oh, do you really think it a bad thing? Why so?
I think they will neither of them do the other any good.
You surprise me. Emma must do Harriet good, and by supplying her with a new object of interest, Harriet may be said to do Emma good. Oh, Mr. Knightley, I shall not allow you to be a fair judge in this case. You are so much used to live alone that you do not know the value of a companion, and perhaps no man can be a good judge of the comfort a woman feels in the society of one of her own sex after being used to it all her life. I can imagine your objection to Harriet Smith. She is not the superior young woman which Emma's friend ought to be. But on the other hand, as Emma wants to see her better informed, it will be an inducement to her to read more herself. They will read together. She means it, I know.
Emma has been meaning to read more ever since she was 12 years old, Mrs. Weston. I have seen a great many lists of her drawing up at various times of books that she meant to read regularly through, and very good lists they were, very well chosen, very neatly arranged, sometimes alphabetically, and sometimes by some other rule. The list she drew up when only 14, I remember thinking it did her judgment so much credit that I preserved it some time, and I dare say she may have made out a very good list now, but I have done with expecting any course of steady reading from Emma. She will never submit to anything requiring industry and patience, and a subjection of the fancy to the understanding. Where Miss Taylor failed to stimulate, I may safely affirm that Harriet Smith will do nothing. You never could persuade her to read half so much as you wished. You know you could not.
I dare say, replied Mrs. Weston, smiling, that I thought so then, but since we have parted, I can never remember Emma's omitting to do anything I wished.
There is hardly any desiring to refresh such a memory as that, said Mr. Knightley feelingly, and for a moment or two he had done. But I, he soon added, who have had no such charm thrown over my senses, must still see, hear, and remember. Emma is spoiled by being the cleverest of her family. At 10 years old, she had the misfortune of being able to answer questions which puzzled her sister at 17. She was always quick and assured, Isabella slow and diffident, and ever since she was 12, Emma has been mistress of the house and of you all.
I either depend upon Emma's good sense more than you do, or am more anxious for her present comfort, for I cannot lament the acquaintance. How well she looked last night.
Oh, you would rather talk of her person than her mind, would you? Very well. I shall not attempt to deny Emma's being pretty.
Pretty? Say beautiful, rather. Can you imagine anything nearer perfect beauty than Emma altogether? Face and figure?
I do not know what I could imagine, but I confess that I have seldom seen a face or figure more pleasing to me than hers. But I am a partial old friend.
Such an eye, the true hazel eye, and so brilliant. Regular features, open countenance, with a complexion. What a bloom of full health, and such a pretty height and size, such a firm and upright figure. There is health, not merely in her bloom, but in her air, her head, her glance. Oh, she is loveliness itself, Mr. Knightley.
I have not a fault to find with her person, he replied. I think her all you describe. I love to look at her, and I will add this praise, that I do not think her personally vain. Considering how very handsome she is, she appears to be little occupied with it. Her vanity lies another way. Mrs. Weston, I am not to be talked out of my dislike of her intimacy with Harriet Smith, or my dread of its doing them both harm.
And I, Mr. Knightley, am equally stout in my confidence of its not doing them any harm. With all dear Emma's little faults, she is an excellent creature. Where shall we see a better daughter, or a kinder sister, or a truer friend? No, no, she has qualities which may be trusted. She will never lead anyone really wrong. She will make no lasting blunder. Where Emma errs once, she is in the right 100 times. Harriet Smith's intimacy at Hartfield was soon a settled thing. Mrs. Goddard and the teachers and the girls, and the affairs of the school in general, formed naturally a great part of the conversation. And, but for her acquaintance with the Martins of Abbey Mill Farm, it must have been the whole. But the Martins occupied her thoughts a good deal. She had spent 2 very happy months with them, and now loved to talk of the pleasures of her visit. For some time Emma was amused, without thinking beyond the immediate cause. But as she came to understand the family better, other feelings arose. When it appeared that the Mr. Martin, who bore a part in the narrative, and was always mentioned with approbation for his great good nature in doing something or other, was a single man, she did suspect danger to her poor little friend from all this hospitality and kindness, and if she were not taken care of, she might be required to sink herself forever. Mr. Elton was the person fixed on by Emma for driving the young farmer out of Harriet's head. She thought it would be an excellent match, and only too palpably desirable, natural and probable for her to have much merit in planning it. She feared it was what everyone must think of and predict. It was not likely, however, that anybody should have equalled her in the date of the plan, as it had entered her brain during the very first evening of Harriet's coming to Hartfield. Emma could not feel a doubt of having given Harriet's fancy a proper direction, and raised the gratitude of her young vanity to a very good purpose, for she found her decidedly more sensible than before of Mr. Elton's being a remarkably handsome man, with most agreeable manners. She was quite convinced of Mr. Elton's being in the fairest way of falling in love, if not in love already. She was pleased with the manner in which he seconded a sudden wish of hers to have Harriet's picture. "Did you ever have your likeness taken, Harriet?" said she. "Did you ever sit for your picture?" Harriet was on the point of leaving the room, and only stopped to say, with a very interesting naivety, "Oh, dear, no, never." No sooner was she out of sight than Emma exclaimed, "What an exquisite possession a good picture of her would be! I almost long to attempt her likeness myself." "Let me entreat you," cried Mr. Elton. "It would indeed be a delight. Oh, let me entreat you, Miss Woodhouse, to exercise so charming a talent in favour of your friend." Harriet was soon back again, and the proposal almost immediately made, and she had no scruples which could stand many minutes against the earnest pressing of both the others. Emma wished to go to work directly, and therefore produced the portfolio containing her various attempts at portraits, for not one of them had ever been finished, that they might decide together on the best size for Harriet. She played and sang, and drew in almost every style, but steadiness had always been wanting, and in nothing had she approached the degree of excellence which she would have been glad to command, and ought not to have failed of. There was merit in every drawing. In the least finished, perhaps the most. Her style was spirited. But had there been much less, or had there been 10 times more, the delight and admiration of her 2 companions would have been the same. They were both in ecstasies. A likeness pleases everybody, and Miss Woodhouse's performances must be capital. The sitting which followed was altogether very satisfactory. She was quite enough pleased with the first day's sketch to wish to go on. The same civilities and courtesies, the same success and satisfaction took place on the morrow, and accompanied the whole progress of the picture, which was rapid and happy. Everybody who saw it was pleased, but Mr. Elton was in continual raptures, and defended it through every criticism. "You have made her too tall, Emma," said Mr. Knightley. Emma knew that she had, but would not own it, and Mr. Elton warmly added, "Oh, no, certainly not too tall. Oh, not in the least too tall." "It is very pretty," said Mr. Woodhouse. "The only thing I do not thoroughly like is that she seems to be sitting out of doors, with only a little shawl over her shoulders. It makes one think she must catch cold." "But, my dear papa, it's supposed to be summer, a warm day in summer. Look at the tree." "But it is never safe to sit out of doors, my dear." "You, sir, may say anything," cried Mr. Elton, "but I must confess that I regard it as a most happy thought, the placing of Miss Smith out of doors, and the tree is touched with such inimitable spirit. Oh, it is most admirable. I cannot keep my eyes from it. I never saw such a likeness." The next thing wanted was to get the picture framed, and here were a few difficulties. It must be done directly. It must be done in London. Mr. Elton's gallantry was always on the alert. Might he be trusted with the commission? What infinite pleasure should he have in executing it? He could ride to London at any time. It was impossible to say how much he should be gratified by being employed on such an errand. "This man is almost too gallant to be in love," thought Emma. "I should say so, but that I suppose there may be 100 different ways of being in love. He is an excellent young man, and will suit Harriet exactly." The very day of Mr. Elton's going to London produced a fresh occasion for Emma's services towards her friend. Harriet received a letter from Mr. Martin containing a direct proposal of marriage. Who could have thought it? She was so surprised she did not know what to do. Yes, quite a proposal of marriage, and a very good letter, at least she thought so, and he wrote as if he really loved her very much, but she did not know, and so she was come as fast as she could to ask Miss Woodhouse what she should do. Emma was half ashamed of her friend for seeming so pleased and so doubtful. "Well," said Harriet, "well, and what shall I do?" "What shall you do? In what respect? Do you mean with regard to this letter?" "Yes." "But what are you in doubt of? You must answer it, of course, and speedily." "Yes, but what shall I say? Oh, dear Miss Woodhouse, do advise me." "Oh, no, no. The letter had much better be all your own. You need not be prompted to write with the appearance of sorrow for his disappointment." "Oh, you think I ought to refuse him, then?" said Harriet, looking down. "Ought to refuse him? My dear Harriet, what do you mean? Are you in any doubt as to that? I thought, but I beg your pardon, perhaps I've been under a mistake. I certainly have been misunderstanding you. If you feel in doubt as to the purport of your answer, I had imagined you were consulting me only as to the wording of it." Harriet was silent. With a little reserve of manner, Emma continued, "You mean to return a favourable answer, I collect?" "No, I do not. That is, I do not mean... What shall I do? What would you advise me to do? Pray, dear Miss Woodhouse, tell me what I ought to do." "Not for the world," said Emma, smiling graciously, "would I advise you either way. You must be the best judge of your own happiness. If you prefer Mr. Martin to every other person, if you think him the most agreeable man you have ever been in company with, why should you hesitate? You blush, Harriet. Does anybody else occur to you at this moment under such a definition? Harriet, do not deceive yourself. Do not be run away with by gratitude and compassion. At this moment, whom are you thinking of?" With some hesitation, Harriet said, "Miss Woodhouse, as you will not give me your opinion, I must do as well as I can by myself, and I have now quite determined and really almost made up my mind to refuse Mr. Martin. Do you think I am right?" "Perfectly, perfectly right, my dearest Harriet. You are doing just what you ought. While you were at all in suspense, I kept my feelings to myself, but now that you are so completely decided, I have no hesitation in approving." Harriet smiled again, and her smiles grew stronger. The next day, Mr. Knightley called and sat down, seemingly inclined for a chat. He began speaking of Harriet. "I have reason to think," he said, "that Harriet Smith will soon have an offer of marriage, and from a most unexceptionable quarter. Robert Martin's the man. Her visit to Abbey Mill this summer seems to have done his business. He is desperately in love and means to marry her." "He is very obliging," said Emma. "But is he sure that Harriet means to marry him?" Well, means to make an offer, then. He came to ask me whether I approved his choice altogether. I was very much pleased with all that he said. I never hear better sense from anyone than Robert Martin. He always speaks to the purpose, open, straightforward, and very well judging. He is an excellent young man, both as son and brother. I had no hesitation in advising him to marry. I was convinced he could not do better. I praised the fair lady, too, and altogether sent him away very happy." "Mr. Knightley," said Emma, who had been smiling to herself through a great part of this speech, "I will tell you something in return for what you have told me. He did speak yesterday, that is, he wrote, and was refused." This was obliged to be repeated before it could be believed, and Mr. Knightley actually looked red with surprise and displeasure as he stood up in tall indignation and said, "Then she is a greater simpleton than I ever believed her. What is the foolish girl about?"
"Oh, to be sure," cried Emma. "It is always incomprehensible to a man that a woman should ever refuse an offer of marriage. A man always imagines a woman to be ready for anybody who asks her."
"Nonsense. A man does not imagine any such thing. But what is the meaning of this? Harriet Smith refuse Robert Martin? Madness if it is so, but I hope you are mistaken."
"I saw her answer. Nothing could be clearer."
"You saw her answer? You wrote her answer too. Emma, this is your doing. You persuaded her to refuse him. And I remember saying to myself, even Emma, with all her partiality for Harriet, will think this a good match."
"I cannot help wondering at your knowing so little of Emma as to say any such thing. What? Think a farmer a good match for my intimate friend?"
"Till you chose to turn her into a friend, her mind had no distaste for her own set, nor any ambition beyond it," said Mr. Knightley. "If she has it now, you have given it. You have been no friend to Harriet Smith, Emma. I have always thought it a very foolish intimacy, though I have kept my thoughts to myself. But I now perceive that it will be a very unfortunate one for Harriet."
"We think so very differently on this point, Mr. Knightley, that there can be no use in canvassing it. We shall only be making each other more angry. She has refused Mr. Martin's proposal, and so decidedly, I think, as must prevent any second application."
"Robert Martin has no great loss, if he can but think so, and I hope it will not be long before he does. Your views for Harriet are best known to yourself, but as you make no secret of your love of matchmaking, it is fair to suppose that you have these views and plans and projects, and as a friend I shall just hint to you that, if Elton is the man, I think it will be all labour in vain."
Emma laughed and disclaimed.
He continued, "Depend upon it, Elton will not do. Elton is a very good sort of man, and a very respectable vicar of Highbury, but not at all likely to make an imprudent match. I have heard him speak with great animation of a large family of young ladies that his sisters are intimate with, who have all £20,000 apiece."
Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley, their 5 children, and a competent number of nursery maids arrived at Highbury for their Christmas visit. Mr. Knightley was to dine at Hartfield, rather against the inclination of Mr. Woodhouse, who did not like that anyone should share with him in Isabella's first day. Emma's sense of right, however, had decided it, and besides the consideration of what was due to each brother, she had particular pleasure, from the circumstances of the late disagreement between Mr. Knightley and herself, in procuring him the proper invitation. She hoped they might now become friends again. She certainly had not been in the wrong, and he would never own that he had. It was time to appear to forget that they had ever quarrelled, and she hoped it might rather assist the restoration of friendship that when he came into the room she had one of the children with her, the youngest, a nice little girl about 8 months old, who was now making her first visit to Hartfield, and very happy to be danced about in her aunt's arms. It did assist, for though he began with grave looks and short questions, he was soon led on to talk of them all in the usual way, and to take the child out of her arms with all the unceremoniousness of perfect amity. Emma felt they were friends again, and the conviction giving her at first great satisfaction, and then a little sauciness, she could not help saying, as he was admiring the baby, "What a comfort it is that we think alike about our nephews and nieces. As to men and women, our opinions are sometimes very different. But with regard to these children, I observe we never disagree."
"If you were as much guided by nature in your estimate of men and women, and as little under the power of fancy and whim in your dealings with them, as you are where these children are concerned, we might always think alike," replied Mr. Knightley.
"To be sure, our discordances must always arise from my being in the wrong."
"Yes," said he, smiling, "and reason good. I was 16 years old when you were born."
"A material difference then," she replied, "and no doubt you were much my superior in judgment at that period of our lives. But does not the lapse of 21 years bring our understandings a good deal nearer?"
"Yes, a good deal nearer."
"But still not near enough to give me a chance of being right if we think differently."
"I still have the advantage of you by 16 years' experience, and by not being a pretty young woman and a spoilt child.
Come, my dear Emma, let us be friends and say no more about it.
Now, Mr. Knightley, a word or two more and I have done. As far as good intentions went, we were both right. And I must say that no effects on my side of the argument have yet proved wrong. I only want to know that Mr. Martin is not very, very bitterly disappointed.
A man cannot be more so, was the short, full answer.
The evening was quiet and conversable, as Mr. Woodhouse declined cards entirely for the sake of comfortable talk with his dear Isabella, and the little party made two natural divisions. On one side he and his daughter, on the other the two Mr. Knightleys, their subjects totally distinct or very rarely mixing, and Emma only occasionally joining in one or the other. The brothers talked of their own concerns and pursuits, and while they were thus comfortably occupied, Mr. Woodhouse was enjoying a full flow of happy regrets and fearful affection with his daughter. "You seem to me to have forgotten Mrs. and Miss Bates, Isabella," said Emma. "I have not heard one inquiry after them." "Oh, the good Bateses," replied her sister. "I am quite ashamed of myself, but you mention them in most of your letters. I hope they are quite well, good old Mrs. Bates. I will call upon her tomorrow. And that sweet, amiable Jane Fairfax, it is so long since I have seen her, except now and then for a moment accidentally in town. Oh, what a happiness it must be to her good old grandmother and the excellent Miss Bates when she comes to visit them. I always regret excessively on dear Emma's account that she cannot be more at Highbury. She would be such a delightful companion for Emma." Mr. Woodhouse agreed to it all, but added, "Our little friend Harriet Smith, however, is just such another pretty kind of young person. You will like Harriet. Emma could not have a better companion than Harriet." "Oh, I am most happy to hear it, but only Jane Fairfax one knows to be so very accomplished and superior, and exactly Emma's age." This topic was discussed very happily, and others succeeded of similar moment and passed away with similar harmony. In general, their evenings were less engaged with friends than their mornings, but one complete dinner engagement, and out of the house too, there was no avoiding, though, at Christmas. Mr. Weston would take no denial. They must all dine at Randall's one day. The evening proposed came, but Harriet Smith was prevented from joining the party by a feverish cold and sore throat. When they arrived, Emma found Mr. Elton so very cheerful in his civilities, however, that she began to think he must have received a different account of Harriet from what had reached her, and enlightened him by saying, "My report from Mrs. Goddard was not so pleasant as I had hoped. Such a sad loss to our party today."
"Ah, dreadful, exactly so indeed. She will be missed every moment."
This was very proper. The sigh which accompanied it was really estimable, but it should have lasted longer. Emma was rather in dismay when only half a minute afterwards he began to speak of other things, and in a voice of the greatest alacrity and enjoyment. She was astonished at Mr. Elton's spirits. Harriet seemed quite forgotten in the expectation of a pleasant party. For her own sake, she could not be rude, and for Harriet's she was even positively civil, but it was an effort, especially as something was going on amongst the others in the most overpowering period of Mr. Elton's nonsense, which she particularly wished to listen to. She heard enough to know that Mr. Weston was giving some information about his son. Now it so happened that in spite of Emma's resolution of never marrying, there was something in the name, in the idea of Mr. Frank Churchill, which always interested her. She had frequently thought, especially since his father's marriage with Miss Taylor, that if she were to marry, he was the very person to suit her in age, character, and condition. She had a great curiosity to see him, a decided intention of finding him pleasant, of being liked by him to a certain degree, and a sort of pleasure in the idea of their being coupled in their friends' imaginations. With such sensations, and in Harriet's absence, Mr. Elton's civilities were dreadfully ill-timed, but she had the comfort of appearing very polite, while feeling very cross, and of thinking that the rest of the visit could not possibly pass without bringing forward the same information again, or the substance of it, from the open-hearted Mr. Weston. So it proved. For when happily released from Mr. Elton and seated by Mr. Weston at dinner, he made use of the very first interval in the cares of hospitality, the very first leisure from the saddle of mutton, to say to her, "I believe you did not hear me telling the others in the drawing-room that we are expecting Frank. I had a letter from him this morning, and he will be with us within a fortnight." "What a very great pleasure it will be to you, and Mrs. Weston is so anxious to be acquainted with him that she must be almost as happy as yourself."
"Yes, she would be," replied Mr. Weston, smiling, "but that she thinks there will be another put-off. It depends entirely upon his aunt's spirits and pleasure. In short, upon her temper. Mrs. Churchill rules at Enscombe, and is a very odd-tempered woman, and his coming now depends upon her being willing to spare him."
"He ought to come," said Emma. "If he could stay only a couple of days, he ought to come, and one can hardly conceive a young man's not having it in his power to do as much as that." Mr. Woodhouse was soon quite ready to go home, and it was as much as his companions could do to entertain away his notice of the lateness of the hour. But at last the bell was rung and the carriage spoken for, and Mr. Woodhouse, always the first object on such occasions, was carefully attended to his own by Mr. Knightley and Mr. Weston. Isabella stepped in after her father. John Knightley stepped in after his wife, very naturally, so that Emma found, on being escorted and followed into the second carriage by Mr. Elton, that the door was to be lawfully shut on them, and that they were to have a tete-a-tete drive. As she believed he had been drinking too much of Mr. Weston's good wine, she felt sure that he would want to be talking nonsense. To restrain him, as much as might be, by her own manners, she was immediately preparing to speak with exquisite calmness and gravity of the weather and the night. But scarcely had she begun than she found her subject cut up, her hand seized, her attention demanded, and Mr. Elton actually making violent love to her, availing himself of the precious opportunity, declaring sentiments which must be already well known, hoping, fearing, adoring, ready to die if she refused him, but flattering himself that his ardent attachment, an unequalled love, an unexampled passion, could not fail of having some effect, and in short, very much resolved on being seriously accepted as soon as possible. It really was so. Without scruple, without apology, without much apparent diffidence, Mr. Elton, the lover of Harriet, was professing himself her lover. She tried to stop him, but vainly. He would go on and say it all. "It is impossible for me to doubt any longer. You have made yourself too clear. Mr. Elton, my astonishment is much beyond anything I can express. After such behaviour as I have witnessed during the last month to Miss Smith, such attentions as I have been in the daily habit of observing, to be addressing me in this manner. Believe me, sir, I am far, very far from gratified in being the object of such professions."
"Good heavens," cried Mr. Elton, "what can be the meaning of this? Miss Smith? I never thought of Miss Smith in the whole course of my existence, never paid her any attentions but as your friend, never cared whether she were dead or alive but as your friend. Oh, Miss Smith, indeed, I need not so totally despair of an equal alliance as to be addressing myself to Miss Smith. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, who can think of Miss Smith when Miss Woodhouse is near? I have thought only of you. Everything that I have said or done for many weeks past has been with the sole view of marking my adoration of yourself. You cannot really seriously doubt it. No, I am sure you have seen and understood me."
It would be impossible to say what Emma felt on hearing this, which, of all her unpleasant sensations, was uppermost. "No, sir," cried Emma. "I have been in a most complete error with respect to your views till this moment. Am I to believe that you have never sought to recommend yourself particularly to Miss Smith, that you have never thought seriously of her?"
"Never, madam," cried he, affronted in his turn. "No, madam. My visits to Hartfield have been for yourself only, and the encouragement I received—"
"Encouragement? I give you encouragement? Sir, you have been entirely mistaken in supposing it. I have seen you only as the admirer of my friend. In no other light could you have been more to me than a common acquaintance. I have no thoughts of matrimony at present." He was too angry to say another word, her manner too decided to invite supplication, and in this state of swelling resentment and mutually deep mortification, they had to continue together a few minutes longer. Without knowing when the carriage turned into Vicarage Lane, or when it stopped, they found themselves all at once at the door of his house, and he was out before another syllable passed, and under indescribable irritation of spirits, she was then conveyed to Hartfield. It was a wretched business indeed. Such an overthrow of everything she had been wishing for. Such a development of everything most unwelcome. Such a blow for Harriet. That was the worst of all. Every part of it brought pain and humiliation of some sort or other, but compared with the evil to Harriet, all was light, and she would gladly have submitted to feel yet more mistaken, more in error, more disgraced by misjudgment than she actually was, could the effects of her blunders have been confined to herself. If I had not persuaded Harriet into liking the man, I could have borne anything. He might have doubled his presumption to me. But poor Harriet, here have I actually talked poor Harriet into being very much attached to this man. She might never have thought of him but for me, and certainly never would have thought of him with hope, if I had not assured her of his attachment. For she is as modest and humble as I used to think him. Oh, that I had been satisfied with persuading her not to accept young Martin. There I was quite right. That was well done of me. But there I should have stopped, and left the rest to time and chance. I was introducing her into good company, and giving her the opportunity of pleasing someone worth having. I ought not to have attempted more. But now, poor girl, her peace is cut up for some time. I have been but half a friend to her, and if she were not to feel this disappointment so very much, I am sure I have not an idea of anybody else who would be at all desirable for her. William Cox. Oh, no, I could not endure William Cox, a pert young lawyer. She stopped to blush and laugh at her own relapse, and then resumed a more serious, more dispiriting cogitation upon what had been, and might be, and must be. A day or two later, a note was brought from Mr. Elton to Mr. Woodhouse, a long, civil, ceremonious note, to say, with Mr. Elton's best compliments, that he was proposing to leave Highbury the following morning on his way to Bath, where, in compliance with the pressing entreaties of some friends, he had engaged to spend a few weeks, and very much regretted the impossibility he was under, from various circumstances of weather and business, of taking a personal leave of Mr. Woodhouse, of whose friendly civilities he should ever retain a grateful sense, and had Mr. Woodhouse any commands, should be happy to attend to them. Emma was most agreeably surprised. Mr. Elton's absence just at this time was the very thing to be desired. She now resolved to keep Harriet no longer in the dark. She had reason to believe her nearly recovered from her cold, and it was desirable that she should have as much time as possible for getting the better of her other complaint before the gentleman's return. She went to Mrs. Goddard's accordingly the very next day, to undergo the necessary penance of communication. And a severe one it was. She had to destroy all the hopes which she had been so industriously feeding, to appear in the ungracious character of the one preferred, and acknowledge herself grossly mistaken and misjudging in all her ideas on one subject, all her observations, all her convictions, all her prophecies for the last 6 weeks. The confession completely renewed her first shame, and the sight of Harriet's tears made her think that she should never be in charity with herself again. Harriet bore the intelligence very well, blaming nobody, and in everything testifying such an ingenuousness of disposition and lowly opinion of herself as must appear with particular advantage at that moment to her friend. Emma was in the humour to value simplicity and modesty to the utmost, and she left her with every previous resolution confirmed, of being humble and discreet, and repressing imagination all the rest of her life. Jane Fairfax was expected in Highbury. Certain it was that she was to come, and that Highbury, instead of welcoming that perfect novelty that had been so long promised it, Mr. Frank Churchill, must put up with Jane Fairfax, who could bring only the freshness of a 2 years' absence. Jane Fairfax was an orphan, the only child of Mrs. Bates's youngest daughter. The marriage of Lieutenant Fairfax, of a regiment of infantry, and Miss Jane Bates had had its day of fame and pleasure, hope and interest, but nothing now remained of it, save the melancholy remembrance of him dying in action abroad, of his widow sinking under consumption and grief soon afterwards, and this girl. The compassionate feelings of a friend of her father gave a change to her destiny. This was Colonel Campbell, who had very highly regarded Fairfax as an excellent officer and most deserving young man. Colonel Campbell was a married man, with only one living child, a girl about Jane's age, and Jane became their guest, paying them long visits and growing a favourite with all. And before she was 9 years old, his daughter's great fondness for her and his own wish of being a real friend united to produce an offer from Colonel Campbell of undertaking the whole charge of her education. It was accepted, and from that period Jane had belonged to Colonel Campbell's family and had lived with them entirely, only visiting her grandmother from time to time. The plan was that she should be brought up for educating others, the very few £100 which she inherited from her father making independence impossible. To provide for her otherwise was out of Colonel Campbell's power, for though his income by pay and appointments was handsome, his fortune was moderate and must be all his daughter's. But by giving her an education, he hoped to be supplying the means of respectable subsistence hereafter. Jane had now reached the age which her own judgment had fixed on for beginning. She had long resolved that 21 should be the period, and the marriage of her friend Miss Campbell fixed her determination to wait no longer. The good sense of Colonel and Mrs. Campbell could not oppose such a resolution, though their feelings did. As long as they lived, no exertions would be necessary. Their home might be hers for ever, and for their own comfort they would have retained her wholly. But this would be selfishness. What must be at last had better be soon. And it was her own choice to spend perhaps her last months of perfect liberty with those kind relations, Mrs. and Miss Bates, to whom she was so very dear. Emma was sorry to have to pay civilities to a person she did not like through 3 long months, to be always doing more than she wished and less than she ought. Why she did not like Jane Fairfax might be a difficult question to answer. Mr. Knightley had once told her it was because she saw in her the really accomplished young woman which she wanted to be thought herself, and though the accusation had been eagerly refuted at the time, there were moments of self-examination in which her conscience would not quite acquit her. But she could never get acquainted with her. She did not know how it was, but there was such coldness and reserve, such apparent indifference whether she pleased or not. And then her aunt was such an eternal talker, and she was made such a fuss with by everybody, and it had been always imagined that they were to be so intimate. Because their ages were the same, everybody had supposed they must be so fond of each other. These were her reasons. She had no better. It was a dislike so little just, every imputed fault was so magnified by fancy, that she never saw Jane Fairfax the first time after any considerable absence without feeling that she had injured her, and now, when the due visit was paid on her arrival after a 2 years' interval, she was particularly struck with the very appearance and manners which for those 2 whole years she had been depreciating. Jane Fairfax was very elegant, remarkably elegant, and she had herself the highest value for elegance. Her height was pretty, just such as almost everybody would think tall, and nobody could think very tall. Her figure particularly graceful, her size a most becoming medium between fat and thin, and then her face, her features. There was more beauty in them altogether than she had remembered. It was not regular, but it was very pleasing beauty. Her eyes, a deep grey, with those dark eyelashes and eyebrows, had never been denied their praise, but the skin, which she had been used to cavil at as wanting colour, had a clearness and delicacy which really needed no fuller bloom. It was a style of beauty of which elegance was the reigning character, and as such she must, in honour by all her principles, admire it. Elegance, which whether of person or of mind, she saw so little in Highbury. There, not to be vulgar, was distinction and merit. In short, she sat, during the first visit, looking at Jane Fairfax with 2-fold complacency, the sense of pleasure and the sense of rendering justice, and was determining that she would dislike her no longer. Upon the whole, Emma left her with such softened, charitable feelings as made her look around in walking home and lament that Highbury afforded no young man worthy of giving her independence, nobody that she could wish to scheme about for her. These were charming feelings, but not lasting. Before she had committed herself by any public profession of eternal friendship for Jane Fairfax, or done more towards a recantation of past prejudices and errors, than saying to Mr. Knightley, "She certainly is handsome, she is better than handsome," Jane had spent an evening at Hartfield with her grandmother and aunt, and everything was relapsing much into its usual state. Former provocations reappeared. The aunt was as tiresome as ever. More tiresome, because anxiety for Jane's health was now added to admiration of her powers, and they had to listen to the description of exactly how little bread and butter she ate for breakfast, and how small a slice of mutton for dinner, as well as to see exhibitions of new caps and new work-bags for her mother and herself. And Jane's offences rose again. They had music. Emma was obliged to play, and the thanks and praise which necessarily followed appeared to her an affectation of candour, an air of greatness, meaning only to show off in higher style Jane's own very superior performance. Miss Fairfax was, besides, which was the worst of all, so cold, so cautious. There was no getting at her real opinion. Wrapped up in a cloak of politeness, she seemed determined to hazard nothing. She was suspiciously reserved. She and Mr. Frank Churchill had been at Weymouth at the same time. It was known that they were a little acquainted, but not a syllable of real information could Emma procure as to what he truly was. Was he handsome? She believed he was reckoned a very fine young man. Was he agreeable? He was generally thought so. Did he appear a sensible young man, a young man of information? At a watering place or in a common London acquaintance, it was difficult to decide on such points. She believed everybody found his manners pleasing. Emma could not forgive her. Emma could not forgive Jane Fairfax. But as neither provocation nor resentment were discerned by Mr. Knightley, who had been of the party, and had seen only proper attention and pleasing behaviour on each side, he was expressing the next morning, being at Hartfield again on business with Mr. Woodhouse, his approbation of the whole. He had been used to think her unjust to Jane, and had now great pleasure in marking an improvement. "A very pleasant evening," he began, as soon as Mr. Woodhouse had been talked into what was necessary, told that he understood, and the papers swept away. "Particularly pleasant. You and Miss Fairfax gave us some very good music. I do not know a more luxurious state, sir, than sitting at one's ease to be entertained a whole evening by two such young women, sometimes with music and sometimes with conversation. I am sure Miss Fairfax must have found the evening pleasant, Emma. You left nothing undone. I was glad you made her play so much, for having no instrument at her grandmother's, it must have been a real indulgence." "I am happy you approved," said Emma, smiling, "but I hope I am not deficient in what is due to guests at Hartfield." "Oh, no, my dear," said her father instantly. "That I'm sure you are not. There is nobody half so attentive and civil as you are. If anything, you are too attentive. The muffin last night, if it had been handed round once, I think it would have been enough." "My dear Emma," said Mr. Knightley, nearly at the same time, moving from his chair into one close by her, "you are not going to tell me, I hope, that you had not a pleasant evening?" "Oh, I hope everybody had a pleasant evening," said Mr. Woodhouse in his quiet way. "I had. Once I felt the fire rather too much, but then I moved back my chair a little, very little, and it did not disturb me. Miss Bates was very chatty and good-humoured, as she always is, though she speaks rather too quick. However, she is very agreeable, and Mrs. Bates too, in a different way. I like old friends. And Miss Jane Fairfax is a very pretty sort of young lady, a very pretty and very well-behaved young lady indeed. She must have found the evening agreeable, Mr. Knightley, because she had Emma." "True, sir, and Emma because she had Miss Fairfax." Emma saw his anxiety, and wishing to appease it, at least for the present, said, and with a sincerity which no one could question, "She is a sort of elegant creature that one cannot keep one's eyes from. I am always watching her to admire, and I do pity her from my heart." Mr. Knightley looked as if he were more gratified than he cared to express, and before he could make any reply, Mr. Woodhouse, whose thoughts were on the Bateses, said, "It is a great pity that their circumstances should be so confined. A great pity indeed, and I have often wished,
Oh, but it is so little one can venture to do. Small, trifling presents of anything uncommon. Now we have killed a porker, and Emma thinks of sending them a loin or a leg. It is very small and delicate. Hartfield pork is not like any other pork, but still it is pork. And, my dear Emma, unless one could be sure of their making it into steaks, nicely fried as ours are fried, without the smallest grease, and not roasted, for no stomach can bear roast pork, I think we had better send the leg. Do you not think so, my dear?
My dear papa, I sent the whole hind quarter. I knew you would wish it. There will be the leg to be salted, you know, which is so very nice, and the loin to be dressed directly in any manner they like.
Oh, that's right, my dear. Very right. I had not thought of it before. But that was the best way. They must not over-salt the leg, and then, if it is not over-salted, and if it is very thoroughly boiled, just as Searle boils ours, and eaten very moderately of, with a boiled turnip and a little carrot or parsnip, I do not consider it unwholesome.
Emma, said Mr. Knightley presently, I have a piece of news for you. You like news, and I heard an article in my way hither that I think will interest you. News? Oh, yes, I always like news. What is it? Why do you smile so? Where did you hear it? At Randall's? He had time only to say, No, not at Randall's. I have not been near Randall's, when the door was thrown open and Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax walked into the room, full of thanks and full of news. Miss Bates knew not which to give quickest. Mr. Knightley soon saw that he had lost his moment, and that not another syllable of communication could rest with him. Oh, my dear sir, how are you this morning, my dear Miss Woodhouse? I come quite overpowered. Such a beautiful hind quarter of pork. You are too bountiful. Have you heard the news? Mr. Elton is going to be married. Emma had not had time to think of Mr. Elton, and she was so completely surprised that she could not avoid a little start and a little blush at the sound. There is my news. I thought it would interest you, said Mr. Knightley with a smile. But where could you hear it? Cried Miss Bates. Where could you possibly hear it, Mr. Knightley? For it is not 5 minutes since I received Mrs. Cole's note. No, it cannot be more than 5, or at least 10, for I had got my bonnet and spencer on, just ready to come out. I was only gone down to speak to Patty again about the pork. Jane was standing in the passage, were you not, Jane? For my mother was so afraid that we had not any salting pan large enough. So I said I would go down and see, and Jane said, shall I go down instead? For I think you have a little cold, and Patty has been washing the kitchen. Oh, my dear, said I. Well, and just then came the note. A Miss Hawkins, that's all I know. A Miss Hawkins of Bath. But, Mr. Knightley, how could you possibly have heard it? For the very moment Mr. Cole told Mrs. Cole of it, she sat down and wrote to me. A Miss Hawkins. I was with Mr. Cole on business an hour and a half ago. He had just read Elton's letter as I was shown in, and handed it to me directly. Well, that is quite... I suppose there never was a piece of news more generally interesting, my dear sir. You really are too bountiful. My mother desires her very best compliments and regards and 1,000 thanks, and says you really quite oppress her. We consider our Hartfield pork, replied Mr. Woodhouse. Indeed, it certainly is so very superior to all other pork that Emma and I cannot have a greater pleasure than... Oh, my dear sirs, my mother says our friends are only too good to us. If ever there were people who, without having great wealth themselves, had everything they could wish for, I am sure it is us. We may well say that our lot is cast in a goodly heritage. Well, Mr. Knightley, and so you actually saw the letter. Well,
it was short, merely to announce, but cheerful, exulting, of course.
Here was a sly glance at Emma.
He had been so fortunate as to, I forget the precise words, one has no business to remember them. The information was, as you state, that he was going to be married to a Miss Hawkins. By this style, I should imagine it just settled.
Mr. Elton going to be married, said Emma as soon as she could speak. He will have everybody's wishes for his happiness. A new neighbour for us all, Miss Woodhouse, said Miss Bates joyfully. Miss Hawkins, I dare say an excellent young woman. His extreme attention to my mother, wanting her to sit in the vicarage pew that she might hear better. My mother is a little deaf, you know. It is not much, but she does not hear quite quick. It is such a happiness when good people get together, and they always do. As to who or what Miss Hawkins is, or how long he has been acquainted with her, said Emma. Nothing, I suppose, can be known. One feels that it cannot be a very long acquaintance. He has been gone only 4 weeks. Nobody had any information to give, and after a few more wonderings, Miss Bates said, "Well, my dear Jane, I believe we must be running away. The weather does not look well, and grandmamma will be uneasy. Oh, you are too obliging, my dear Miss Woodhouse, but we really must take leave. This has been a most agreeable piece of news indeed. Good morning to you, my dear sir. Oh, Mr. Knightley is coming. Well, that is so very... I am sure if Jane is tired, you will be so kind as to give her your arm. Good morning to you." It was to Emma an amusing and a very welcome piece of news, as proving that Mr. Elton could not have suffered long. But she was sorry for Harriet. Harriet must feel it. It was now about the time that she was likely to call. If she were to meet Miss Bates in her way, the intelligence would undoubtedly rush upon her without preparation. The expected shower was heavy, but short, and it had not been over 5 minutes when in came Harriet, with just the heated, agitated look which hurrying thither with a full heart was likely to give, and the "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think has happened?" which instantly burst forth, had all the evidence of corresponding perturbation. Harriet had taken shelter at Ford's. Ford's was the principal woolen draper, linen draper, and haberdasher's shop united, the shop first in size and fashion in the place. And so there she had sat, without an idea of anything in the world, full 10 minutes perhaps, when all of a sudden who should come in but Elizabeth Martin and her brother. "Dear Miss Woodhouse, only think, I thought I should have fainted. I did not know what to do. I was sitting near the door. Elizabeth saw me directly, but he did not. He was busy with the umbrella. I am sure she saw me, but she looked away directly and took no notice, and they both went to quite the farther end of the shop, and I kept sitting near the door. Oh dear, I was so miserable. I must have been as white as my gown. I'm sure they were talking of me, and I could not help thinking that he was persuading her to speak to me. Do you think he was, Miss Woodhouse? For presently she came forward, came quite up to me, and asked me how I did, and seemed ready to shake hands, if I would. She did not do any of it in the same way that she used. I could see she was altered, but however she seemed to try to be very friendly, and we shook hands and stood talking some time, and she said she was sorry we never met now, which I thought almost too kind. Oh dear, Miss Woodhouse, I was absolutely miserable, and then, only think, I found he was coming up towards me too, slowly, you know, as if he did not quite know what to do, and so he came and spoke, and I answered, and I stood for a minute feeling dreadfully, you know, one can't tell how, and then I took courage and said it did not rain and I must go, and so off I set, and I had not got 3 yards from the door when he came after me, only to say if I was going to Hartfield, he thought I had much better go round by Mr. Cole's stables, for I should find the near way quite flooded by this rain. So I said I was very much obliged to him. You know I could not do less, and then he went back to Elizabeth, and I came round by the stables. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do talk to me and make me comfortable again." Very sincerely did Emma wish to do so, but it was not immediately in her power. She was obliged to stop and think. She was not thoroughly comfortable herself. The young man's conduct and his sister's seemed the result of real feeling, and she could not but pity them. But she had believed them to be well-meaning, worthy people before, and what difference did this make in the evils of the connection? It was folly to be disturbed by it. "It might be distressing for the moment," said she, "but you seem to have behaved extremely well, and it is over, and may never, can never, as a first meeting, occur again, and therefore you need not think about it." Harriet said, "Very true," and she would not think about it, but still she talked of it. Still she could talk of nothing else. And Emma, at last, in order to put the Martins out of her head, was obliged to hurry on the news, which she had meant to give with so much tender caution, hardly knowing herself whether to rejoice or be angry, ashamed or only amused, at such a state of mind in poor Harriet, such a conclusion of Mr. Elton's importance with her. Human Human nature is so well disposed towards those who are in interesting situations that a young person who either marries or dies is sure of being kindly spoken of. A week had not passed since Miss Hawkins's name was first mentioned in Highbury before she was, by some means or other, discovered to have every recommendation of person and mind. And when Mr. Elton himself arrived to triumph in his happy prospects and circulate the fame of her merits, there was very little more for him to do than tell her Christian name and say whose music she principally played. Mr. Elton returned a very happy man. He had gone away rejected and mortified. He came back gay and self-satisfied, eager and busy, caring nothing for Miss Woodhouse and defying Miss Smith. The charming Augusta Hawkins, in addition to all the usual advantages of perfect beauty and merit, was in possession of an independent fortune of so many thousand as would always be called 10. He had caught both substance and shadow, both fortune and affection, and was just the happy man he ought to be, talking only of himself and his own concerns, and with cordial, fearless smiles, now addressing all the young ladies of the place, to whom a few weeks ago he would have been more cautiously gallant. The wedding was no distant event, and when he next entered Highbury, he would bring his bride. During his present short stay, Emma had barely seen him, but just enough to feel that the first meeting was over, and to give her the impression of his not being improved by the mixture of pique and pretension now spread over his air. She was, in fact, beginning very much to wonder that she had ever thought him pleasing at all, and his sight was so inseparably connected with some very disagreeable feelings that, except in a moral light, as a penance, a lesson, a source of profitable humiliation to her own mind, she would have been thankful to be assured of never seeing him again. Of the lady individually, Emma thought very little. She was good enough for Mr. Elton, no doubt, accomplished enough for Highbury, handsome enough to look plain, probably, by Harriet's side, and all the grandeur of the connection seemed dependent on the elder sister, who was very well married to a gentleman in a great way near Bristol, who kept 2 carriages. That was the wind-up of the history. That was the glory of Miss Hawkins. Could she but have given Harriet her feelings about it all? She had talked her into love, but alas, she was not so easily to be talked out of it. The charm of an object to occupy the many vacancies of Harriet's mind was not to be talked away. He might be superseded by another. He certainly would indeed. Nothing could be clearer, for Harriet was one of those who, having once begun, would be always in love. Had it been a allowable entertainment, had there been no pain to her friend or reproach to herself in the wavering of Harriet's mind, Emma would have been amused by its variations. Sometimes Mr. Elton predominated, sometimes the Martins, and each was occasionally useful as a check to the other. Mr. Elton's engagement had been the cure of the agitation of meeting Mr. Martin. The unhappiness produced by the knowledge of that engagement had been a little put aside by Elizabeth Martin's calling at Mrs. Goddard's a few days afterwards. Harriet had not been at home, but a note had been prepared and left for her, written with a great deal of kindness, and, till Mr. Elton himself appeared, she had been much occupied by it. But meeting Mr. Elton in person had driven away all such cares. While he stayed, the Martins were forgotten, and on the very morning of his setting off for Bath again, Emma, to dissipate some of the distress it occasioned, judged it best for her to return Elizabeth Martin's visit. On their return from this short and formal visit, Emma, tired of the schemes and contrivances, felt the necessity for a little consolation, and resolved on going home by way of Randalls to procure it. Her mind was quite sick of Mr. Elton and the Martins. But on their way the carriage stopped. She looked up. It was stopped by Mr. and Mrs. Weston. There was an instant pleasure in the sight of them, and still greater pleasure was conveyed in sound, for Mr. Weston immediately accosted her with,
"How do you do? How do you do? We have been sitting with your father. Glad to see him look so well. Frank comes tomorrow. Had a letter this morning. We see him tomorrow by dinner time to a certainty. He is at Oxford today, and he comes for a whole fortnight. I shall soon bring him over to Hartfield."
"Think of me tomorrow, my dear Emma, about 4 o'clock," was Mrs. Weston's parting injunction, spoken with some anxiety, and meant only for her. The morning of the interesting day arrived, and Mrs. Weston's faithful pupil did not forget either at 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock that she was to think of her at 4. The clock struck 12 as she passed through the hall. "'Tis 12. I shall not forget to think of you 4 hours hence, and by this time tomorrow perhaps, or a little later, I may be thinking of the possibility of their all calling here. I am sure they will bring him soon." She opened the parlour door and saw 2 gentlemen sitting with her father, Mr. Weston and his son. They had been arrived only a few minutes, and Mr. Weston had scarcely finished his explanation of Frank's being a day before his time, and her father was not yet in the midst of his very civil welcome and congratulations, when she appeared to have her share of surprise, introduction, and pleasure. The Frank Churchill so long talked of, so high in interest, was actually before her. He was presented to her, and she did not think too much had been said in his praise. He was a very good-looking young man. Height, air, address, all were unexceptionable, and his countenance had a great deal of the spirit and liveliness of his father's. He looked quick and sensible. She felt immediately that she should like him, and there was a well-bred ease of manner and a readiness to talk which convinced her that he came intending to be acquainted with her, and that acquainted they soon must be. Their subjects in general were such as belonged to an opening acquaintance. On his side were the inquiries, was she a horsewoman, pleasant walks, had they a large neighbourhood, Highbury perhaps afforded society enough, was it a musical society? But when satisfied on all these points, and their acquaintance proportionably advanced, he contrived to find an opportunity, while their 2 fathers were engaged with each other, of introducing his mother-in-law, and speaking of her with so much handsome praise, so much warm admiration, so much gratitude for the happiness she secured to his father, and her very kind reception of himself, as was an additional proof of his knowing how to please, and of his certainly thinking it worth-while to try to please her. He did not advance a word of praise beyond what she knew to be thoroughly deserved by Mrs. Weston, but he got as near as he could to thanking her for Miss Taylor's merits, without seeming quite to forget that in the common course of things it was to be rather supposed that Miss Taylor had formed Miss Woodhouse's character than Miss Woodhouse Miss Taylor's, and at last, as if resolved to qualify his opinion completely for travelling round to its object, he wound it all up with astonishment at the youth and beauty of her person. "You cannot see too much perfection in Mrs. Weston for my feelings," said Emma, "but she would be ready to quarrel with you for using such words. Don't let her imagine that you have spoken of her as a pretty young woman." "I hope I should know better," he replied. "No, depend upon it," with a gallant bow, "that in addressing Mrs. Weston I should understand whom I might praise without any danger of being thought extravagant in my terms." Emma wondered whether the same suspicion of what might be expected of their knowing each other, which had taken strong possession of her mind, had ever crossed his, and whether his compliments were to be considered as marks of acquiescence or proof of defiance. She must see more of him to understand his ways. At present she only felt they were agreeable. She had no doubt of what Mr. Weston was often thinking about. His quick eye she detected again and again glancing towards them with a happy expression, and even when he might have determined not to look, she was confident that he was often listening. Her own father's perfect exemption from any thought of the kind, the entire deficiency in him of all such sort of penetration or suspicion, was a most comfortable circumstance. Though always objecting to every marriage that was arranged, He never suffered beforehand from the apprehension of any. It seemed as if he could not think so ill of any two persons' understanding as to suppose they meant to marry till it were proved against them. She blessed the favouring blindness. A reasonable visit paid, Mr. Weston began to move. His son rose immediately also, saying, "As you are going farther on business, sir, I will take the opportunity of paying a visit, which must be paid some day or other, and therefore may as well be paid now. I have the honour of being acquainted with a neighbour of yours, a family of the name of Fairfax. I shall have no difficulty, I suppose, in finding the house, though Fairfax, I believe, is not the proper name. I should rather say Barnes or Bates. Do you know any family of that name?" "To be sure we do," cried his father. "Mrs. Bates. We passed her house. True, you are acquainted with Miss Fairfax. I remember you knew her at Weymouth, and a fine girl she is. Oh, call upon her by all means." "Oh, there is no necessity for my calling this morning," said Frank Churchill. "Another day would do as well, but there was that degree of acquaintance at Weymouth which—" "Oh, go today. Do not defer it. Besides, I must give you a hint, Frank. Any want of attention to her here should be carefully avoided. You saw her with the Campbells when she was the equal of everybody she mixed with, but here she is with a poor old grandmother who has barely enough to live on. If you do not call early, it will be a slight." The son looked convinced. "I have heard her speak of the acquaintance," said Emma. "She is a very elegant young woman." He agreed to it, but with so quiet a "yes" as inclined her almost to doubt his real concurrence. "If you were never particularly struck by her manners before," said Emma, "I think you will today. You will see her to advantage. See her and hear her. No, I am afraid you will not hear her at all, for she has an aunt who never holds her tongue." Then, with a cordial nod from one and a graceful bow from the other, the two gentlemen took leave, and Emma remained very well pleased with this beginning of the acquaintance. The next morning brought Mr. Frank Churchill again. He came with Mrs. Weston, to whom and to Highbury he seemed to take very cordially. And there was time enough for Emma to form a reasonable judgment, as their visit included all the rest of the morning. He was delighted with everything, admired Hartfield sufficiently for Mr. Woodhouse's ear, and when their going farther was resolved on, confessed his wish to be made acquainted with the whole village, and found matter of commendation and interest much oftener than Emma could have supposed. When they reached a point almost facing the house where the Bateses lodged, Emma recollected his intended visit the day before, and asked him if he had paid it.
"Yes. Oh, yes," he replied. "I was just going to mention it. A very successful visit. I saw all the three ladies, and felt very obliged to you for your preparatory hint. If the talking aunt had taken me quite by surprise, it must have been the death of me. As it was, I was only betrayed into paying a most unreasonable visit. 10 minutes would have been all that was necessary, perhaps all that was proper, but I found that I had been actually sitting with them very nearly 3/4 of an hour. The good lady had not given me the possibility of escape before."
"And how did you think Miss Fairfax looking?"
"Ill. Very ill. That is, if a young lady can ever be allowed to look ill. But the expression is hardly admissible, Mrs. Weston, is it? Ladies can never look ill. And seriously, Miss Fairfax is naturally so pale as almost always to give the appearance of ill health. A most deplorable want of complexion."
"Well," said Emma, "there is no disputing about taste. At least you admire her, except her complexion."
He shook his head and laughed. "I cannot separate Miss Fairfax and her complexion."
"Did you see her often at Weymouth? Were you often in the same society?"
He did not answer immediately, then said, "It is always the lady's right to decide on the degree of acquaintance. Miss Fairfax must already have given her account. I shall not commit myself by claiming more than she may choose to allow."
"Upon my word, you answer as discreetly as she could do herself. But her account of everything leaves so much to be guessed. She is so very reserved, so very unwilling to give the least information about anybody, that I really think you may say what you like of your acquaintance with her."
May I, indeed? Then I will speak the truth, and nothing suits me so well. I met her frequently at Weymouth. I had known the Campbells a little in town, and at Weymouth we were very much in the same set. Colonel Campbell is a very agreeable man, and Mrs. Campbell a friendly, warm-hearted woman. I like them all.
You know Miss Fairfax's situation in life, I conclude, what she is destined to be.
Yes, I believe I do. Did you ever hear the young lady we were speaking of play? He went on.
Ever hear her? Repeated Emma. You forget how much she belongs to Highbury. I have heard her every year of our lives since we both began. She plays charmingly.
You think so, do you? I wanted the opinion of someone who could really judge. She appeared to me to play well, that is, with considerable taste, but I know nothing of the matter myself. I am excessively fond of music, but without the smallest skill or right of judging anybody's performance. I have been used to hear hers admired, and I remember one proof of her being thought to play well. A man, a very musical man, and in love with another woman, engaged to her, on the point of marriage, would yet never ask that other woman to sit down to the instrument if the lady in question could sit down instead. Never seemed to like to hear one if he could hear the other. That, I thought, in a man of known musical talent, was some proof.
Proof indeed, said Emma, highly amused. Miss Campbell's husband, Mr. Dixon, is very musical, is he? We shall know more about them all in half an hour from you than Miss Fairfax would have vouchsafed in half a year.
He looked surprised. You, who have known Miss Fairfax from a child.
I have known her from a child, undoubtedly. We have been children and women together, and it is natural to suppose that we should be intimate, that we should have taken to each other whenever she visited her friends, but we never did. I hardly know how it has happened. A little, perhaps, from the wickedness on my side, which was prone to take disgust towards a girl so idolized and so cried up as she always was by her aunt and her grandmother and all their set. And then her reserve. I never could attach myself to anyone so completely reserved.
It is a most repulsive quality indeed, said he. Oftentimes very convenient, no doubt, but never pleasing. There is safety in reserve, but no attraction. One cannot love a reserved person.
Not till the reserve ceases towards oneself. Intimacy between Miss Fairfax and me is quite out of the question. I have no reason to think ill of her, not the least, except that such extreme and perpetual cautiousness of word and manner, such a dread of giving a distinct idea about anybody, is apt to suggest suspicions of there being something to conceal. He perfectly agreed with her, and after walking together so long, and thinking so much alike, Emma felt herself so well acquainted with him that she could hardly believe it to be only their second meeting. She thought with pleasure that their next meeting would not be long delayed, as both she and the party from Randalls, as well as many other friends and acquaintances, had been invited to the Coleses' house on the following Tuesday. Emma's very good opinion of Frank Churchill was a little shaken the following day by hearing that he was gone off to London merely to have his hair cut. A sudden freak seemed to have seized him at breakfast, and he had sent for a chaise and set off, intending to return to dinner, but with no more important view that appeared than having his hair cut. There was certainly no harm in his travelling 16 miles twice over on such an errand, but there was an air of foppery and nonsense in it which she could not approve. Vanity, extravagance, love of change, restlessness of temper, which must be doing something, good or bad, heedlessness as to the pleasure of his father and Mrs. Weston, indifferent as to how his conduct might appear in general, he became liable to all these charges. His father only called him a coxcomb, and thought it a very good story. But that Mrs. Weston did not like it was clear enough by her passing it over as quickly as possible and making no other comment than that all young people would have their little whims. There was one person among his new acquaintance in Surrey not so leniently disposed. In general, he was judged, throughout the parishes of Donwell and Highbury, with great candour. Liberal allowances were made for the little excesses of such a handsome young man, one who smiled so often and bowed so well. but there was one spirit among them not to be softened from its power of censure by bows or smiles. Mr. Knightley. The circumstance was told him at Hartfield. For the moment he was silent, but Emma heard him almost immediately afterwards say to himself, over a newspaper he held in his hand,
Just the trifling, silly fellow I took him for.
She had half a mind to resent, but an instant's observation convinced her that it was really said only to relieve his own feelings, and not meant to provoke, and therefore she let it pass. Frank Churchill came back again, had had his hair cut, and laughed at himself with a very good grace, but without seeming really at all ashamed of what he had done. He was quite as undaunted and as lively as ever, and after seeing him, Emma thus moralized to herself. I do not know whether it ought to be so, but certainly silly things do cease to be silly if they are done by sensible people in an impudent way. Wickedness is always wickedness, but folly is not always folly. It depends upon the character of those who handle it. No, he is not the trifling, silly young man Mr. Knightley would have him. If he were, he would have done this differently. He would have either gloried in the achievement or been ashamed of it. There would have been either the ostentation of a coxcomb or the evasions of a mind too weak to defend its own vanities. No, I am perfectly sure that he is not trifling or silly. With Tuesday came the agreeable prospect of seeing him again, and for a longer time than hitherto, of judging of his general manners, and, by inference, of the meaning of his manners towards herself, of guessing how soon it might be necessary for her to throw coldness into her air, and of fancying what the observations of all those might be who were now seeing them together for the first time. Mrs. Goddard and Mrs. Bates being able to come and sit with Mr. Woodhouse, Emma's last pleasing duty before she left the house was to pay her respects to them as they sat together after dinner, and while her father was fondly noticing the beauty of her dress, to make the two ladies all the amends in her power by helping them to large slices of cake and full glasses of wine, for whatever unwilling self-denial his care of their constitution might have obliged them to practice during the meal. She had provided a plentiful dinner for them. She wished she could know that they had been allowed to eat it. She followed another carriage to Mr. Cole's door, and was pleased to see that it was Mr. Knightley's. For Mr. Knightley, having a great deal of health, activity, and independence, was too apt, in Emma's opinion, to get about as he could, and not use his carriage so often as became the owner of Donwell Abbey. She had an opportunity now of speaking her approbation while warm from her heart, for he stopped to hand her out. "Now this is coming as you should do," said she, "like a gentleman. I am quite glad to see you." He thanked her, observing, "How lucky that we should arrive at the same moment, for if we had met first in the drawing-room, I doubt whether you would have discerned me to be more of a gentleman than usual. You might not have distinguished how I came by my look or manner." "Yes, I should. I'm sure I should. There is always a look of consciousness or bustle when people come in a way which they know to be beneath them. You think you carry it off very well, I dare say, but with you it is a sort of bravado. Now you have nothing to try for. You are not afraid of being supposed ashamed. You are not striving to look taller than anybody else. Now I shall be really very happy to walk into the same room with you." "Nonsensical girl," was his reply, but not at all in anger. Emma had as much reason to be satisfied with the rest of the party as with Mr. Knightley. She was received with a cordial respect which could not but please, and given all the consequence she could wish for. When the Westons arrived, the kindest looks of love, the strongest of admiration, were for her, from both husband and wife. The son approached her with a cheerful eagerness which marked her as his peculiar object, and at dinner she found him seated by her, and, as she firmly believed, not without some dexterity on his side. The party was rather large, all the usual set as well as some others, and at dinner they were too numerous for any subject of conversation to be general. The first remote sound to which she felt herself obliged to attend was the name of Jane Fairfax. Mrs. Cole seemed to be relating something of her that was expected to be very interesting. She was telling that she had been calling on Miss Bates, and as soon as she entered the room had been struck by the sight of a pianoforte, a very elegant-looking instrument, and the substance of the story, the end of all the dialogue which ensued of surprise and inquiry and congratulations on her side and explanations on Miss Bates's, was that this pianoforte had arrived from Broadwood's the day before, to the great astonishment of both aunt and niece, entirely unexpected, that at first Jane herself was quite at a loss, quite bewildered to think who could possibly have ordered it. But now they were both perfectly satisfied that it could be from only one quarter. Of course it must be from Colonel Campbell. Mrs. Cole had many to agree with her. Everybody who spoke on the subject was equally convinced that it must come from Colonel Campbell, and equally rejoiced that such a present had been made. Mrs. Weston, kind-hearted and musical, was particularly interested by the circumstance, and Emma could not help being amused at her perseverance in dwelling on the subject, and having so much to ask and to say as to tone, touch, and pedal, totally unsuspicious of that wish of saying as little about it as possible, which she plainly read in the fair heroine's countenance. Then, finding that nothing more was to be entrapped from any communication, Emma turned to Frank Churchill. "Why do you smile?" said she.
"Nay, why do you?"
"Me? I suppose I smile for pleasure at Colonel Campbell's being so rich and so liberal. It is a handsome present."
"Very."
"I rather wonder that it was never made before."
"Perhaps Miss Fairfax has never been staying here so long before."
"Or that he did not give her the use of their own instrument, which must now be shut up in London untouched by anybody.
That is a grand pianoforte, and he might think it too large for Mrs. Bates's house."
Emma said no more. Other subjects took their turn, the rest of the dinner passed away, the dessert succeeded, amid the usual rate of conversation. The ladies had not been long in the drawing-room before they were joined by some of the gentlemen, and the very first of the early was Frank Churchill. In he walked, the first and the handsomest, made his way directly to the opposite side of the circle where sat Miss Woodhouse, and, till he could find a seat by her, would not sit at all. Emma divined what everybody present must be thinking. She was his object, and everybody must perceive it. He told her that he had been impatient to leave the dining-room, hated sitting long, was always the first to move when he could. "I have made a most wretched discovery," said he. "I have been here a week tomorrow, half my time. I never knew days fly so fast. A week tomorrow, and I have hardly begun to enjoy myself, but just got acquainted with Mrs. Weston and others. Oh, I hate the recollection." "Perhaps you may now begin to regret that you spent one whole day out of so few in having your hair cut."
"No," said he, smiling. "That is no subject of regret at all. I have no pleasure in seeing my friends unless I can believe myself fit to be seen."
The rest of the gentlemen being now in the room, Emma found herself obliged to turn from him for a few minutes and listen to Mr. Cole. When Mr. Cole had moved away, and her attention could be restored as before, she saw Frank Churchill looking intently across the room at Miss Fairfax, who was sitting exactly opposite. "What is the matter?" said she. He started.
"Oh, thank you for rousing me," he replied. "I believe I have been very rude, but really Miss Fairfax has done her hair in so odd a way that I cannot keep my eyes from her. I never saw anything so outré. This must be a fancy of her own. I must go and ask her whether it is a new fashion. Shall I? I declare I will, and you shall see how she takes it."
He was gone immediately, and Emma soon saw him standing before Miss Fairfax and talking to her. But as to its effect on the young lady, as he had improvidently placed himself exactly between them, she could absolutely distinguish nothing. Before he could return to his chair, it was taken by Mrs. Weston. "This is the luxury of a large party," said she. "One can get near everybody and say everything. My dear Emma, I am longing to talk to you. Do you know how Miss Bates and her niece came here?" "How?" "Why, in Mr. Knightley's carriage."
"Very likely," said Emma. "I know no man more likely than Mr. Knightley to do anything really good-natured, useful, considerate, or benevolent. He is not a gallant man,
But he is a very humane one, and this, considering Jane Fairfax's ill health, would appear a case of humanity to him. I know he had horses today, for we arrived together, and I laughed at him about it, but he said not a word that could betray." "Well," said Mrs. Weston, smiling, "you give him credit for more simple, disinterested benevolence in this instance than I do. For while Miss Bates was talking, a suspicion darted into my head, and I have never been able to get it out again. The more I think of it, the more probable it appears. In short, I have made a match between Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax. See the consequence of keeping your company? What do you say to it?" "Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax!" exclaimed Emma. "Dear Mrs. Weston, how could you think of such a thing? Mr. Knightley? Mr. Knightley must not marry. You would not have little Henry cut out from Donwell. Oh, no, no, Henry must have Donwell. I cannot at all consent to Mr. Knightley's marrying, and I am sure it is not at all likely. I am amazed that you should think of such a thing." "My dear Emma, I told you what led me to think of it. If Mr. Knightley really wished to marry, you would not have him refrain on Henry's account, a boy of 6 years old, who knows nothing of the matter." "Yes, I would. I could not bear to have Henry supplanted. Mr. Knightley marry? No. I have never had such an idea, and I cannot adopt it now. And Jane Fairfax, too, of all women. Excepting inequality of fortune and perhaps a little disparity of age, I can see nothing unsuitable." "But Mr. Knightley does not want to marry. I am sure he has not the least idea of it. Do not put it into his head. Why should he marry? He is as happy as possible by himself, with his farm and his sheep and his library and all the parish to manage, and he is extremely fond of his brother's children. He has no occasion to marry, either to fill up his time or his heart." "My dear Emma, as long as he thinks so, it is so. But if he really loves Jane Fairfax—" "Nonsense! He does not care about Jane Fairfax. How would he bear to have Miss Bates belonging to him, to have her haunting the Abbey and thanking him all day long for his great kindness in marrying Jane? So very kind and obliging, but he always had been such a very kind neighbour, and then fly off through half a sentence to her mother's old petticoat. Not that it was such a very old petticoat either, for still it would last a great while, and indeed she must thankfully say that their petticoats were all very strong." "For shame, Emma, do not mimic her. You divert me against my conscience. And upon my word, I do not think Mr. Knightley would be much disturbed by Miss Bates. Little things do not irritate him. She might talk on, and if he wanted to say anything himself, he would only talk louder and drown her voice. But the question is not whether it would be a bad connection for him, but whether he wishes it, and I think he does. Oh, and I had almost forgotten one idea that occurred to me. This pianoforte that has been sent here by somebody. Though we have all been so well satisfied to consider it a present from the Campbells, may it not be from Mr. Knightley? I cannot help suspecting him. I think he is just the person to do it, even without being in love." "Then it can be no argument to prove that he is in love." They combated the point some time longer in the same way, till a little bustle in the room showed them that tea was over, and the instrument in preparation, and the same moment Mr. Cole approaching to entreat Miss Woodhouse would do them the honour of trying it. And as, in every respect, it suited Emma best to lead, she gave a very proper compliance. She knew the limitations of her own powers too well to attempt more than she could perform with credit. She wanted neither taste nor spirit in the little things which are generally acceptable, and could accompany her own voice well. One accompaniment to her song took her agreeably by surprise. A second, slightly but correctly taken by Frank Churchill. Her pardon was duly begged at the close of the song, and everything usual followed. He was accused of having a delightful voice and a perfect knowledge of music, which was properly denied, and that he knew nothing of the matter and had no voice at all, roundly asserted. They sang together once more, and Emma would then resign her place to Miss Fairfax, whose performance, both vocal and instrumental, she never could attempt to conceal from herself, was infinitely superior to her own. With mixed feelings, she seated herself at a little distance from the numbers round the instrument to listen. Frank Churchill sang again. They had sung together once or twice, it appeared, at Weymouth. But the sight of Mr. Knightley, among the most attentive, soon drew away half Emma's mind, and she fell into a train of thinking on the subject of Mrs. Weston's suspicions, to which the sweet sounds of the united voices gave only momentary interruptions. Her objections to Mr. Knightley's marrying did not in the least subside, and as to herself, she could not at all endure the idea of Jane Fairfax at Donwell Abbey. A Mrs. Knightley for them all to give way to? No. Mr. Knightley must never marry. Little Henry must remain the heir of Donwell. Here ceased the concert part of the evening, but soon the proposal of dancing was so effectually promoted by Mr. and Mrs. Cole that everything was rapidly cleared away to give proper space. And Frank Churchill, coming up with most becoming gallantry to Emma, had secured her hand and led her to the top. They were a couple worth looking at. It may be possible to do without dancing entirely. Instances have been known of young people passing many, many months successively without being at any ball of any description, and no material injury accrue to either body or mind. But when a beginning is made, when the felicities of rapid motion have once been, though slightly felt, it must be a very heavy set that does not ask for more. Frank Churchill had danced once at Highbury, and longed to dance again. Before the middle of the next day, he was at Hartfield. "Well, Miss Woodhouse," he almost immediately began, "may I hope for the honour of your hand for the first 2 dances of a little projected ball to be given at the Crown Inn?" "The Crown?" "My father and Mrs. Weston are at the Crown at this moment," said Frank Churchill, "examining the capabilities of the house. I left them there and came on to Hartfield, impatient for your opinion, and hoping that you might be persuaded to join them and give your advice on the plan. I was desired to say so from both. It would be the greatest pleasure to them if you could allow me to attend you there. They can do nothing satisfactorily without you." Emma was most happy to be called to such a council. The 2 young people set off together without delay for the Crown. There were Mr. and Mrs. Weston, delighted to see her and receive her approbation, she in some little distress, and he finding everything perfect. "Emma," said she, "this paper is worse than I expected. Look, in places you see it is dreadfully dirty, and the wainscot is more yellow and forlorn than anything I could have imagined." "My dear, you are too particular," said her husband. "What does all that signify? You will see nothing of it by candlelight. It will be as clean as Randall's by candlelight. We never see anything of it on our club nights." The ladies here probably exchanged looks which meant, "Men never know when things are dirty or not," and the gentlemen perhaps thought each to himself, "Women will have their little nonsenses and needless cares." One perplexity, however, arose which the gentleman did not disdain. It regarded a supper-room. Mrs. Weston proposed having no regular supper, merely sandwiches, etc., set out in the little room. But that was scouted as a wretched suggestion. A private dance, without sitting down to supper, was pronounced an infamous fraud upon the rights of men and women, and Mrs. Weston must not speak of it again. "I think we do want a larger council. Suppose I go and invite Miss Bates to join us," cried Frank. "Well, if you please," said Mrs. Weston, "if you think she will be of any use." "You will get nothing to the purpose from Miss Bates," said Emma. "She will be all delight and gratitude, but she will tell you nothing. She will not even listen to your questions. I see no advantage in consulting Miss Bates." "But she is so amusing, so extremely amusing. I am very fond of hearing Miss Bates talk, and I need not bring the whole family, you know." Here Mr. Weston joined them, and on hearing what was proposed, gave it his decided approbation. "I do, Frank. Go and fetch Miss Bates, and let us end the matter at once. She will enjoy the scheme, I am sure, and I do not know a properer person for showing us how to do away difficulties. Fetch Miss Bates. We are growing a little too nice. She is a standing lesson of how to be happy. But fetch them both. Invite them both." "Both, sir? Can the old lady—"
The old lady, no, the young lady to be sure. I shall think you a great blockhead, Frank, if you bring the aunt without the niece. Oh, I beg your pardon, sir. I did not immediately recollect. Undoubtedly, if you wish it, I will endeavour to persuade them both. And away he ran. Before long he reappeared, attending the short, neat, brisk-moving aunt and her elegant niece. All the rest, in speculation at least, was perfectly smooth. Frank had already written to his aunt at Enscombe to propose staying a few days beyond his fortnight, which could not possibly be refused, and a delightful dance it was to be. One thing only was wanting to make the prospect of the ball completely satisfactory to Emma, its being fixed for a day within the granted term of Frank Churchill's stay in Surrey. For, in spite of Mr. Weston's confidence, she could not think it so very impossible that the Churchills might not allow their nephew to remain a day beyond his fortnight. Enscombe, however, was gracious. His wish of staying longer evidently did not please, but it was not opposed. Emma, being now certain of her ball, began to adopt as the next vexation Mr. Knightley's provoking indifference about it, either because he did not dance himself, or because the plan had been formed without his being consulted. He seemed resolved that it should not interest him, determined against its exciting any present curiosity, or affording him any future amusement. Alas, there was soon no leisure for quarrelling with Mr. Knightley. 2 days of joyful security were immediately followed by the overthrow of everything. A letter arrived from Mr. Churchill to urge his nephew's instant return. Mrs. Churchill was unwell, far too unwell to do without him. She had been in a very suffering state, so said her husband, when writing to her nephew 2 days before, though from her usual unwillingness to give pain and constant habit of never thinking of herself, she had not mentioned it. But now she was too ill to trifle, and must entreat him to set off for Enscombe without delay. The substance of this letter was forwarded to Emma in a note from Mrs. Weston instantly. She added that he could only allow himself time to hurry to Highbury after breakfast and take leave of the few friends there whom he could suppose to feel any interest in him, and that he might be expected at Hartfield very soon. Emma was ready for her visitor some time before he appeared, but if this reflected at all upon his impatience, his sorrowful look and total want of spirits when he did come might redeem him. He felt the going away almost too much to speak of it. His dejection was most evident. He sat really lost in thought for the first few minutes, and when rousing himself, it was only to say, "Of all horrid things, leave-taking is the worst." "But you will come again," said Emma. "This will not be your only visit to Randalls, but our poor ball must be quite given up." "If I can come again, we are still to have our ball. My father depends on it. Do not forget your engagement." Emma looked graciously. "Such a fortnight as it has been," he continued, "every day more precious and more delightful than the day before. Every day making me less fit to bear any other place. Happy those who can remain at Highbury." "And you must be off this very morning?" "Yes. My father is to join me here. We shall walk back together, and I must be off immediately. I am almost afraid that every moment will bring him." "Not 5 minutes to spare, even for your friends Miss Fairfax and Miss Bates? How unlucky! Miss Bates's powerful argumentative mind might have strengthened yours." "Yes, I have called there. Passing the door, I thought it better. It was the right thing to do. I went in for 3 minutes and was detained by Miss Bates's being absent. She was out, and I felt it impossible not to wait till she came in. She is a woman that one may, or that one must laugh at, but that one would not wish to slight. It was better to pay my visit then." He hesitated, got up, walked to a window. "In short," said he, "perhaps, Miss Woodhouse, I think you can hardly be quite without suspicion." He looked at her, as if wanting to read her thoughts. She hardly knew what to say. It seemed like the forerunner of something absolutely serious, which she did not wish. Forcing herself to speak, therefore, in the hope of putting it by, she calmly said, "You were quite in the right. It was most natural to pay your visit then." He was silent. She believed he was looking at her,
probably reflecting on what she had said and trying to understand the manner. She heard him sigh. It was natural for him to feel that he had cause to sigh. He could not believe her to be encouraging him. A few awkward moments passed, and he sat down again, and in a more determined manner said, "It was something to feel that all the rest of my time might be given to Hartfield. My regard for Hartfield is most warm." He stopped again, rose again, and seemed quite embarrassed. He was more in love with her than Emma had supposed, and who can say how it might have ended if his father had not made his appearance? A very friendly shake of the hand, a very earnest "goodbye" closed the speech, and the door had soon shut out Frank Churchill. Short had been the notice, short their meeting. He was gone, and Emma felt so sorry to part, and foresaw so great a loss to their little society from his absence, as to begin to be afraid of being too sorry and feeling it too much. To complete every other recommendation, he had almost told her that he loved her. What strength or what constancy of affection he might be subject to was another point, but at present she could not doubt his having decidedly warm admiration, a conscious preference of herself, and this persuasion, joined to all the rest, made her think that she must be a little in love with him, in spite of every previous determination against it. "I certainly must," said she. "This sensation of listlessness, weariness, stupidity, this disinclination to sit down and employ myself, this feeling of everything's being dull and insipid about the house. I must be in love. I should be the oddest creature in the world if I were not, for a few weeks at least." Emma continued to entertain no doubt of her being in love. Her ideas only varied as to how much. At first she thought it was a good deal, and afterwards but little. He is undoubtedly very much in love. Everything denotes it. Very much in love indeed. And when he comes again, if his affection continue, I must be on my guard not to encourage it. It would be most inexcusable to do otherwise, as my own mind is quite made up. When his letter to Mrs. Weston arrived, Emma had the perusal of it, and she read it with a degree of pleasure. The charm of her own name was not wanting. Miss Woodhouse appeared more than once, and never without something of pleasing connection, either a compliment to her taste or a remembrance of what she had said. Compressed into the very lowest vacant corner were these words: "I had not a spare moment on Tuesday, as you know, for Miss Woodhouse's beautiful little friend. Pray make my excuses and adieus to her." This, Emma could not doubt, was all for herself. Harriet was remembered only from being her friend. Gratifying, however, and stimulative as was the letter in the material part, its sentiments, she yet found, when it was folded up and returned to Mrs. Weston, had not added any lasting warmth. She could still do without the writer, and he must learn to do without her. Her resolution of refusal only grew more interesting by the addition of a scheme for his subsequent consolation and happiness. His recollection of Harriet, and the words which clothed it, "the beautiful little friend," suggested to her the idea of Harriet succeeding her in his affections. Was it impossible? For Harriet it would be advantageous and delightful indeed. "I must not dwell upon it," said she. "I must not think of it. I know the danger of indulging such speculations. But stranger things have happened, and when we cease to care for each other as we do now, it will be the means of confirming us in that sort of true, disinterested friendship which I can already look forward to with pleasure." Mrs. Elton was first seen at church, but though devotion might be interrupted, curiosity could not be satisfied by a bride in a pew, and it must be left for the visits in form which were then to be paid to settle whether she were very pretty indeed, or only rather pretty, or not pretty at all. Emma had feelings less of curiosity than of pride or propriety to make her resolve on not being the last to pay her respects. and she made a point of Harriet's going with her, that the worst of the business might be gone through as soon as possible. The quarter of an hour quite convinced her that Mrs. Elton was a vain woman, extremely well satisfied with herself and thinking much of her own importance, that she meant to shine and be very superior, but with manners which had been formed in a bad school, pert and familiar, that all her notions were drawn from one set of people and one style of living, that if not foolish, she was ignorant, and that her society would certainly do Mr. Elton no good. The following weeks confirmed her opinion. Mrs. Elton took up a patronizing friendship with Jane Fairfax, spoke with vulgar familiarity of the Westons and even of Mr. Knightley, and tried to take Emma herself under her wing, with what success it may be imagined. May brought Mrs. Churchill to Richmond by her physician's order, and Mr. Frank Churchill to Highbury. No misfortune occurred again to prevent the ball at the Crown Inn. The day arrived, and after a morning of some anxious watching, Frank Churchill reached Randalls before dinner, and everything was safe. Emma wished she might be able to keep him from an absolute declaration. That would be so very painful a conclusion of their present acquaintance, and yet she could not help rather anticipating something decisive. At the ball they met with the utmost friendliness. There could be no doubt of his great pleasure in seeing her, but she had an almost instant doubt of his caring for her as he had done, of his feeling the same tenderness in the same degree. She watched him well. It was a clear thing he was less in love than he had been. Absence, with the conviction probably of her indifference, had produced this very natural, very desirable effect. He was standing by her, but not steadily. There was a restlessness which showed a mind not at ease. He was looking about, he was going to the door, he was watching for the sound of other carriages, impatient to begin, or afraid of being always near her. Mr. and Mrs. Elton appeared, and all the smiles and the proprieties passed. In a few minutes the carriage bearing Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax arrived. Somebody talked of rain. "I will see that there are umbrellas, sir," said Frank to his father. "Miss Bates must not be forgotten," and away he went. He returned to his station by Emma, and as soon as Miss Bates was quiet, she found herself necessarily overhearing the discourse of Mrs. Elton and Miss Fairfax, who were standing a little way behind. Mr. Elton had just joined them, and his wife was exclaiming, "Oh, you have found us out at last, have you, in our seclusion? I was this moment telling Jane I thought you would begin to be impatient for tidings of us."
"Jane?" repeated Frank Churchill with a look of surprise and displeasure. "That is familiar, but Miss Fairfax does not disapprove it, I suppose."
Emma could hardly understand him. He seemed in an odd humour. He walked off to find his father, but was quickly back again with both Mr. and Mrs. Weston. He had met with them in a little perplexity, which must be laid before Emma. It had just occurred to Mrs. Weston that Mrs. Elton must be asked to begin the ball, that she would expect it, which interfered with all their wishes of giving Emma that distinction. Emma heard the sad truth with fortitude. She must submit to stand second to Mrs. Elton, though she had always considered the ball was peculiarly for her. It was almost enough to make her think of marrying. There was nothing like flirtation between Emma and her partner. They seemed more like cheerful, easy friends than lovers. That Frank Churchill thought less of her than he had done was indubitable. The ball proceeded pleasantly. The anxious cares, the incessant attentions of Mrs. Weston were not thrown away. Everybody seemed happy, and the praise of being a delightful ball, which is seldom bestowed till after the ball has ceased to be, was repeatedly given in the very beginning of the existence of this. The 2 last dances before supper were begun, and Harriet had no partner, the only young lady sitting down. The kind-hearted, gentle Mrs. Weston had left her seat to say, "Do you not dance, Mr. Elton?" To which his prompt reply was, "Most readily, Mrs. Weston, if you will dance with me." "Me? Oh, no. I would get you a better partner than myself. I am no dancer, but there is a young lady disengaged whom I should be very glad to see dancing. Miss Smith."
"Miss Smith? Oh, I had not observed. You are extremely obliging, and if I were not an old married man... but my dancing days are over, Mrs. Weston. You will excuse me. Anything else I should be most happy to do at your command, but my dancing days are over."
Mrs. Weston said no more, and Emma could imagine with what surprise and mortification she must be returning to her seat. This was Mr. Elton, the amiable, obliging, gentle Mr. Elton. She would not look again. Her heart was in a glow, and she feared her face might be as hot. In another moment, a happier sight caught her. Mr. Knightley leading Harriet to the set. Never had she been more surprised, seldom more delighted than at that instant. She was all pleasure and gratitude, both for Harriet and herself, and longed to be thanking him, and though too distant for speech, her countenance said much as soon as she could catch his eye again. His dancing proved to be just what she had believed it, extremely good, and Harriet would have seemed almost too lucky if it had not been for the cruel state of things before, and for the very complete enjoyment and very high sense of the distinction which her happy features announced. It was not thrown away on her. She bounded higher than ever, flew farther down the middle, and was in a continual course of smiles. Emma had no opportunity of speaking to Mr. Knightley till after supper. He was warm in his reprobation of Mr. Elton's conduct. It had been unpardonable rudeness. They were interrupted by the bustle of Mr. Weston calling on everybody to begin dancing again. "Come, Miss Woodhouse, Miss Otway, Miss Fairfax, what are you all doing? Come, Emma, set your companions the example. Everybody is lazy, everybody is asleep." "I am ready," said Emma, "whenever I am wanted."
"Whom are you going to dance with?" asked Mr. Knightley.
She hesitated a moment and then replied, "With you, if you will ask me."
"Will you?"
said he, offering his hand. "Indeed I will. You have shown that you can dance, and you know we are not really so much brother and sister as to make it at all improper."
"Brother and sister? No, indeed."
A very few days had passed after this adventure when Harriet came one morning to Emma with a small parcel in her hand, and after hesitating began, "Miss Woodhouse, I have something that I should like to tell you, a sort of confession to make, and then, you know, it will be over." Emma was a good deal surprised, but begged her to speak. There was a seriousness in Harriet's manner which prepared her, quite as much as her words, for something more than ordinary. "It is my duty, and I am sure it is my wish," she continued, "to have no reserves with you on this subject. As I am happily quite an altered creature in one respect, it is very fit that you should have the satisfaction of knowing it. How I could so long a time be fancying myself, it seems like madness. However, now I will destroy it all, and it is my particular wish to do so in your presence, that you may see how rational I am grown. Cannot you guess what this parcel holds?" "Not the least in the world. Did he ever give you anything?" "No, but they are things that I have valued very much." She held the parcel towards her, and Emma read the words, "Most precious treasures," on the top. Her curiosity was greatly excited. Within abundance of silver paper was a pretty little Tunbridge ware box, which Harriet opened. It was well lined with the softest cotton, but, excepting the cotton, Emma saw only a small piece of court plaster. "Now," said Harriet, "you must recollect." "No, indeed I do not." "Dear me, I should not have thought it possible you could forget what passed in this very room about court plaster. Do not you remember his cutting his finger with your new penknife, and your recommending court plaster? And I took mine out and cut him a piece, but it was a great deal too large, and he cut it smaller, and kept playing some time with what was left before he gave it back to me. And so then, in my nonsense, I could not help making a treasure of it." "And you actually put this piece of court plaster by for his sake?" said Emma, divided between wonder and amusement. And secretly she added to herself, "Lord bless me, when should I ever have thought of putting by in cotton a piece of court plaster that Frank Churchill had been pulling about? I never was equal to this." "Here," resumed Harriet, turning to her box again, "here is something still more valuable. I mean that has been more valuable, because this is what did really once belong to him, which the court plaster never did." Emma was quite eager to see this superior treasure. It was the end of an old pencil, the part without any lead.
"This was really his," said Harriet. "Do not you remember one morning, perhaps it was the Tuesday or the Wednesday before that evening, he wanted to make a memorandum in his pocket-book. It was about spruce beer. Mr. Knightley had been telling him something about brewing spruce beer, and he wanted to put it down. But when he took out his pencil, there was so little lead that he soon cut it all away, and it would not do, so you lent him another, and this was left upon the table as good for nothing. But I kept my eye on it, and as soon as I dare, caught it up, and never parted with it again from that moment."
"I do remember it," cried Emma. "I perfectly remember it."
"Oh, that's all. I have nothing more to show you. I am now going to throw them both behind the fire, and I wish you to see me do it."
"My poor dear Harriet, and have you actually found happiness in treasuring up these things?"
"Yes, simpleton as I was, but I am quite ashamed of it now, and wish I could forget as easily as I can learn them. It was very wrong of me, you know, to keep any remembrances after he was married. There they go, and there is an end, thank heaven, of Mr. Elton."
And when, thought Emma, will there be a beginning of Mr. Churchill? Mr. Knightley, who for some reason best known to himself had certainly taken an early dislike to Frank Churchill, was only growing to dislike him more. He began to suspect him of some double dealing in his pursuit of Emma. That Emma was his object appeared indisputable. Everything declared it. His own attentions, his father's hints, his mother-in-law's guarded silence, it was all in unison. Words, conduct, discretion and indiscretion told the same story. But while so many were devoting him to Emma, and Emma herself making him over to Harriet, Mr. Knightley began to suspect him of some inclination to trifle with Jane Fairfax. He could not understand it, but there were symptoms of intelligence between them, he thought so at least, which, having once observed, he could not persuade himself to think entirely void of meaning, however he might wish to escape any of Emma's errors of imagination. She was not present when the suspicion first arose. He was dining with the Randalls family and Jane at the Eltons, and he had seen more than a single look at Miss Fairfax, which, from the admirer of Miss Woodhouse, seemed somewhat out of place. When he was again in their company, he could not help remembering what he had seen, nor could he avoid observation, which brought him yet stronger suspicion of there being something of private liking, of private understanding even, between Frank Churchill and Jane. He owed it to Emma to risk anything that might be involved in an unwelcome interference rather than her welfare, to encounter anything rather than the remembrance of neglect in such a cause. "My dear Emma," said he at last, with earnest kindness, "do you think you perfectly understand the degree of acquaintance between the gentleman and lady we have been speaking of?" "Between Mr. Frank Churchill and Miss Fairfax? Oh, yes, perfectly. Why do you make a doubt of it?" "Have you never at any time had reason to think that he admired her, or that she admired him?" "Never for the 20th part of a moment did such an idea occur to me. And how could it possibly come into your head?" "I have lately imagined that I saw symptoms of attachment between them, certain expressive looks, which I did not believe meant to be public." "Oh, you amuse me excessively. I am delighted to find that you can vouchsafe to let your imagination wander. But it will not do. Indeed it will not do. There is no admiration between them, I do assure you. They are as far from any attachment or admiration for one another as any two beings in the world can be. That is, I presume it to be so on her side, and I can answer for its being so on his. I will answer for the gentleman's indifference." She spoke with a confidence which staggered, with a satisfaction which silenced Mr. Knightley. Mrs. Elton had long wished to form an exploring party to go to Box Hill. It was now the middle of June, and the weather fine, and Mrs. Elton was growing impatient to name the day and settle with Mr. Weston as to pigeon pies and cold lamb, when a lame carriage-horse threw everything into sad uncertainty. "These delays and disappointments are quite odious. What are we to do? The year will wear away at this rate and nothing done," she said to Mr. Knightley. "You had better explore to Donwell," replied Mr. Knightley. "That may be done without horses.
Come and eat my strawberries. They are ripening fast."
If Mr. Knightley did not begin seriously, he was obliged to proceed so, for his proposal was caught at with delight, and the "Oh, I should like it of all things" was not plainer in words than manner. Donwell was famous for its strawberry beds, but cabbage beds would have been enough to tempt the lady who only wanted to be going somewhere. "You may depend upon me," said she. "I certainly will come. Name your day and I will come, and you will allow me to bring Jane Fairfax?"
"I cannot name a day," said he, "till I have spoken to some others whom I would wish to meet you."
"Oh, leave all that to me. Only give me a carte blanche. I am Lady Patroness, you know. It is my party. I will bring friends with me."
"I hope you will bring Elton," said he, "but I will not trouble you to give any other invitations."
"Married women, you know, may be safely authorized. It is my party. Leave it all to me. I will invite your guests."
"No," he calmly replied. "There is but one married woman in the world whom I can ever allow to invite what guests she pleases to Donwell, and that one is—"
"Mrs. Weston, I suppose,"
interrupted Mrs. Elton, rather mortified. "No, Mrs. Knightley. Until she is in being, I will manage such matters myself."
"You are a humorist, and may say what you like. Well, I shall bring Jane with me, Jane and her aunt. The rest I leave to you. I have no objections at all to meeting the Hartfield family. Don't scruple. I know you are attached to them."
"You certainly will meet them if I can prevail, and I shall call on Miss Bates in my way home."
"That's quite unnecessary. I see Jane every day. But as you like. It is to be a morning scheme, you know, Mr. Knightley. Quite a simple thing. I shall wear a large bonnet and bring one of my little baskets hanging on my arm. Here, probably this basket with pink ribbon. Nothing can be more simple, you see. And Jane will have such another. There is to be no form or parade. A sort of gypsy party. We are to walk about your gardens and gather the strawberries ourselves and sit under the trees and whatever else you may like to provide. It is to be all out of doors. A table spread in the shade, you know. Everything as natural and simple as possible. Is not that your idea?"
"Not quite. My idea of the simple and the natural will be to have the table spread in the dining room. The nature and the simplicity of gentlemen and ladies with their servants and furniture, I think, is best observed by meals within doors. When you are tired of eating strawberries in the garden, there shall be cold meat in the house."
It was so long since Emma had been at the Abbey that she was glad to look around her, eager to refresh and correct her memory with more particular observation, more exact understanding of a house and grounds which must ever be so interesting to her and all her family. Seats tolerably in the shade were found, and now Emma was obliged to overhear what Mrs. Elton and Jane Fairfax were talking of. A situation. A most desirable situation was in question. Mrs. Elton had received notice of it that morning and was in raptures. It was with a Mrs. Smallridge. It was charming, superior, and Mrs. Elton was wild to have the offer closed with immediately. She positively refused to take her friend's negative, though Miss Fairfax continued to assure her that she would not at present engage in anything. How Jane could bear it all was astonishing to Emma. She did look vexed. She did speak pointedly, and at last, with a decision of action unusual to her, proposed a removal. Should not they walk? Would not Mr. Knightley show them the gardens? The pertinacity of her friend seemed more than she could bear. It was hot, and after walking some time over the garden in a scattered, dispersed way, scarcely any three together, they insensibly followed one another to the delicious shade of a broad, short avenue of limes, which, stretching beyond the garden at an equal distance from the river, seemed to finish off the pleasure grounds. It was a sweet view, English verdure, English culture, English comfort, seen under a sun, bright without being oppressive. In this walk, Emma and Mr. Weston found all the others assembled, and towards this view she immediately perceived Mr. Knightley and Harriet, distinct from the rest, quietly leading the way. Mr. Knightley and Harriet. It was an odd tete-a-tete, but she was glad to see it. She did not suspect him of his former matchmakings. It was too old a story. Robert Martin had probably ceased to think of Harriet. They took a few turns together along the walk. The shade was most refreshing, and Emma found it the pleasantest part of the day. The next remove was to the house. They must all go in and eat, and they were all seated and busy, and still Frank Churchill did not come. For, in spite of Mr. Knightley's dislike, his inclusion in the invitation to Donwell was a matter of course. Later, Emma walked into the hall for the sake of a few moments' free observation of the entrance and ground plot of the house, and was hardly there when Jane Fairfax appeared, coming quickly in from the garden and with a look of escape. Little expecting to meet Miss Woodhouse so soon, there was a start at first, but Miss Woodhouse was the very person she was in quest of.
"Oh, will you be so kind," said she, "when I am missed, as to say that I am gone home. I am going this moment. My aunt is not aware how late it is, nor how long we have been absent, but I am sure we shall be wanted, and I am determined to go directly. I have said nothing about it to anybody. It would only be giving trouble and distress. Some are gone to the ponds, some to the lime walk. Till they all come in, I shall not be missed, and when they do, will you have the goodness to say that I am gone?"
"Certainly, if you wish it. But you are not going to walk to Highbury alone."
"Yes. What would hurt me? I walk fast. I shall be at home in 20 minutes.
"But it is too far. Indeed it is. To be walking quite alone. Oh, let my father's servant go with you. Let me order the carriage. It can be round in 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you, but on no account. I would rather walk. And for me, to be afraid of walking alone? I, who may so soon have to guard others. The greatest kindness you can show me will be to let me have my own way, and only say that I am gone when it is necessary."
Emma had not another word to oppose. She saw it all, and entering into her feelings, promoted her quitting the house immediately, and watched her safely off with the zeal of a friend. Her parting look was grateful, and her parting words, "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, the comfort of being sometimes alone," seemed to burst from an overcharged heart, and to describe somewhat of the continual endurance to be practised by her, even towards some of those who loved her best. Such a home indeed, such an aunt, thought Emma, as she turned back into the hall again. I do pity you, and the more sensibility you betray of their just horrors, the more I shall like you. Jane had not been gone a quarter of an hour when Frank Churchill entered the room. Emma had not been thinking of him. She had forgotten to think of him, but she was very glad to see him. They sat down, and while Frank Churchill talked, Emma listened and looked, and soon perceived that his state might be best defined by the expressive phrase of being out of humour. Some people were always cross when they were hot. Such might be his constitution, and as she knew that eating and drinking were often the cure of such incidental complaints, she recommended his taking some refreshment. He would find abundance of everything in the dining room, and she humanely pointed out the door. No, he should not eat. He was not hungry. It would only make him hotter. In 2 minutes, however, he relented in his own favour, and muttering something about spruce beer, walked off, leaving Emma to say in secret, "I am glad I have done being in love with him. I should not like a man who is so soon discomposed by a hot morning. Harriet's sweet, easy temper will not mind it." He was gone long enough to have had a very comfortable meal, and came back all the better, grown quite cool, and with good manners like himself, able to draw a chair close to her, and at last made himself talk nonsense very agreeably. Emma soon said, "We are going to Box Hill tomorrow. You will stay and go with us?" "Well, if you wish me to stay and join the party, I will." She smiled her acceptance, and nothing less than a summons from Richmond was to take him back before the following evening. They had a very fine day for Box Hill, and all the other outward circumstances of arrangement, accommodation, and punctuality were in favour of a pleasant party. 7 miles were travelled in expectation of enjoyment, and everybody had a burst of admiration on first arriving. But in the general amount of the day, there was deficiency. At first it was downright dullness to Emma. She had never seen Frank Churchill so silent and stupid. When they all sat down it was better. To her taste, a great deal better, for Frank Churchill grew talkative and gay, making her his first object.
"How much I am obliged to you," said he, "for telling me to come today. If it had not been for you, I should certainly have lost all the happiness of this party. I had quite determined to go away again."
Your gallantry is really unanswerable. But nobody speaks except ourselves, and it is rather too much to be talking nonsense for the entertainment of 7 silent people.
"I say nothing of which I am ashamed," replied he. "Let everybody on the hill hear me if they can. Our companions are excessively stupid. What shall we do to rouse them? Any nonsense will serve. They shall talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse to say that she requires something very entertaining from each of you in a general way. Here are 7 of you, besides myself, who she is pleased to say am very entertaining already. And she only demands from each of you either one thing very clever, be it prose or verse, or 2 things moderately clever, or 3 things very dull indeed, and she engages to laugh heartily at them all."
"Oh, very well," exclaimed Miss Bates. "Then I need not be uneasy. 3 things very dull indeed. That will just do for me, you know. I shall be sure to say 3 dull things as soon as ever I open my mouth, shan't I?"
Emma could not resist. "Ah, ma'am, but there may be a difficulty. Pardon me, but you will be limited as to number, only 3 at once." Miss Bates, deceived by the mock ceremony of her manner, did not immediately catch her meaning, but when it burst on her, it could not anger, though a slight blush showed that it could pain her.
"Ah, well, to be sure. Yes, I see what she means, and I will try to hold my tongue." "Oh, for myself, I protest I must be excused," said Mrs. Elton. "I really cannot attempt. I am not at all fond of that sort of thing. I do not have witty things at everybody's service. I have a great deal of vivacity in my own way, but I really must be allowed to judge when to speak and when to hold my tongue. Pass us, if you please, Mr. Churchill. Pass Mr. E., Knightley, Jane, and myself. We have nothing clever to say, not one of us."
"Yes, yes, pray pass me," added her husband. "I have nothing to say that can entertain Miss Woodhouse or any other young lady. An old married man, quite good for nothing. Shall we walk, Augusta?"
"With all my heart. I am really tired of exploring so long on one spot. Come, Jane, take my other arm."
Jane declined it, however, and the husband and wife walked off.
"Happy couple," said Frank Churchill as soon as they were out of hearing. "How well they suit one another. Very lucky, marrying as they did, upon an acquaintance formed only in a public place. It is only by seeing women in their own homes, among their own set, just as they always are, that you can form any just judgment. Short of that, it's all guess and luck, and will generally be ill luck. How many a man has committed himself on a short acquaintance, and rued it all the rest of his life?"
Miss Fairfax, who had seldom spoken before, except among her own confederates, spoke now.
"Such things do occur, undoubtedly."
She was stopped by a cough. Frank Churchill turned towards her to listen.
"You were speaking," said he gravely.
She recovered her voice.
"I was only going to observe that though such unfortunate circumstances do sometimes occur both to men and women, I cannot imagine them to be very frequent. A hasty and imprudent attachment may arise, but there is generally time to recover from it afterwards. I would be understood to mean that it can only be weak, irresolute characters whose happiness must be always at the mercy of chance, who will suffer an unfortunate acquaintance to be an inconvenience, an oppression forever."
He made no answer, merely looked, and bowed in submission.
"Now, ma'am," said Jane to her aunt, "shall we join Mrs. Elton?"
"If you please, my dear. With all my heart, I am quite ready." Even Emma grew tired at last of flattery and merriment. The appearance of the servants looking out for them to give notice of the carriages was a joyful sight, and even the bustle of collecting and preparing to depart were gladly endured in the prospect of the quiet drive home, which was to close the very questionable enjoyments of this day of pleasure. Such another scheme, composed of so many ill-assorted people, she hoped never to be betrayed into again. While waiting for the carriage, she found Mr. Knightley by her side. He looked round, as if to see that no one were near, and then said, "Emma, I must once more speak to you as I have been used to do, a privilege rather endured than allowed, perhaps, but I must still use it. I cannot see you acting wrong without a remonstrance. How could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates? How could you be so insolent in your wit to a woman of her character, age, and situation? Emma, I had not thought it possible." Emma recollected, blushed, was sorry, but tried to laugh it off. "Nay, how could I help saying what I did? Nobody could have helped it. It was not so very bad. I dare say she did not understand me."
"I assure you she did. She felt your full meaning. She has talked of it since. I wish you could have heard how she talked of it, with what candour and generosity. I wish you could have heard her honouring your forbearance, in being able to pay her such attentions as she was forever receiving from yourself and your father, when her society must be so irksome. Were she your equal in situation, but Emma, consider how far this is from being the case. She is poor, she has sunk from the comfort she was born to, and, if she lived to old age, must probably sink more. Her situation should secure your compassion. It was badly done indeed. You, whom she had known from an infant, whom she had seen grow up from a period when her notice was an honour, to have you now in thoughtless spirits and the pride of the moment laugh at her, humble her, and before her niece too, and before others, many of whom, certainly some, would be entirely guided by your treatment of her. This is not pleasant to you, Emma, and it is very far from pleasant to me. But I will tell you truths while I can, satisfied with proving myself your friend by very faithful counsel, and trusting that you will some time or other do me greater justice than you can do now." While they talked, they were advancing towards the carriage. It was ready, and before she could speak again, he had handed her in. He had misinterpreted the feelings which had kept her face averted and her tongue motionless. They were combined only of anger against herself, mortification, and deep concern. She was most forcibly struck. The truth of his representation there was no denying. She felt it at her heart. How could she have been so brutal, so cruel to Miss Bates? How could she have exposed herself to such ill opinion in anyone she valued? And how suffer him to leave her without saying one word of gratitude, of concurrence, of common kindness? Time did not compose her. As she reflected more, she seemed but to feel it more. She never had been so depressed. The wretchedness of the scheme to Box Hill was in Emma's thoughts all the evening. Miss Bates should never again, no, never. If attention in future could do away the past, she might hope to be forgiven. She had been often remiss, her conscience told her so, remiss perhaps more in thought than fact, scornful, ungracious, but it should be so no more. In the warmth of true contrition, she would call upon her the very next morning, and it should be the beginning on her side of a regular, equal, kindly intercourse. She was just as determined when the morrow came, and went early, that nothing might prevent her. The ladies were all at home. There was a bustle on her approach, a good deal of moving and talking. Miss Bates soon came, very happy and obliged, but Emma's conscience told her that there was not the same cheerful volubility as before, less ease of look and manner. A very friendly inquiry after Miss Fairfax, she hoped, might lead the way to a return of old feelings. The touch seemed immediate. "Ah, Miss Woodhouse, how kind you are. I suppose you have heard, and are come to give us joy. This does not seem much like joy indeed in me, but it will be very trying for us to part with her, after having had her so long. It is a great change, and though she is amazingly fortunate, such a situation, I suppose, as no young woman before ever met with on first going out. Do not think us ungrateful, Miss Woodhouse, for such surprising good fortune. But poor dear soul, if you were to see what a headache she has. When one is in great pain, you know one cannot feel any blessing quite as it may deserve. She is as low as possible. To look at her, nobody would think how delighted and happy she is to have secured such a situation. You will excuse her not coming to you. She says
She shall soon be well. She will be extremely sorry to miss seeing you, Miss Woodhouse, but your kindness will excuse her. Emma was most sincerely interested. Her heart had long been growing kinder towards Jane, and this picture of her present sufferings acted as a cure of every former ungenerous suspicion, and left her nothing but pity. Where, may I ask, is Miss Fairfax going? To a Mrs. Smallridge, charming woman, most superior, to have the charge of her 3 little girls, delightful children, impossible that any situation could be more replete with comfort. Mrs. Elton, I suppose, has been the person to whom Miss Fairfax owes... Yes, our good Mrs. Elton, the most indefatigable true friend. She would not take a denial. She would not let Jane say no. For when Jane first heard of it, it was the day before yesterday, the very morning we were at Donwell, when Jane first heard of it, she was quite decided against accepting the offer. But sure enough, yesterday evening it was all settled that Jane should go. Quite a surprise to me. I had not the least idea. Jane took Mrs. Elton aside and told her at once that upon thinking over the advantages of Mrs. Smallridge's situation, she had come to the resolution of accepting it. I did not know a word of it till it was all settled. Miss Fairfax, I suppose, though you were not aware of it, had been making up her mind the whole day. I dare say she had. And when is Miss Fairfax to leave you? Oh, very soon. Very soon indeed. That's the worst of it. Within a fortnight.
The following day brought news from Richmond to throw everything else into the background. An express arrived at Randalls to announce the death of Mrs. Churchill. Though her nephew had had no particular reason to hasten back on her account, she had not lived above 36 hours after his return. A sudden seizure, of a different nature from anything foreboded by her general state, had carried her off after a short struggle. The great Mrs. Churchill was no more. One morning, about 10 days after Mrs. Churchill's decease, Emma was called downstairs to Mr. Weston, who could not stay 5 minutes and wanted particularly to speak with her. "Can you come to Randalls at any time this morning? Do, if it be possible. Mrs. Weston wants to see you. She must see you." They hurried off and speedily arrived at Randalls. Mrs. Weston was looking so ill and had an air of so much perturbation that Emma's uneasiness increased, and the moment they were alone she eagerly said, "What is it, my dear friend?" "Cannot you, my dear Emma, cannot you form a guess as to what you are to hear?" "So far as that it relates to Mr. Frank Churchill, I do guess." "You are right. It does relate to him, and I will tell you directly. He has been here this very morning on a most extraordinary errand. It is impossible to express our surprise. He came to speak to his father on a subject, to announce an attachment." Emma thought first of herself, then of Harriet. "More than an attachment, indeed," resumed Mrs. Weston. "An engagement. A positive engagement. What will you say, Emma? What will anybody say when it is known that Frank Churchill and Miss Fairfax are engaged? Nay, that they have been long engaged." Emma even jumped with surprise, and horror-struck exclaimed, "Jane Fairfax, good God! You are not serious. You do not mean it." "You may well be amazed, but it is even so. There has been a solemn engagement between them ever since October, formed at Weymouth and kept a secret from everybody, not a creature knowing it but themselves. It is yet almost incredible to myself. I can hardly believe it. I thought I knew him." Emma scarcely heard what was said. Her mind was divided between 2 ideas, her own former conversations with him about Miss Fairfax, and poor Harriet, and for some time she could only exclaim and require repeated confirmation. "Well," she said at last, trying to recover herself, "this is a circumstance which I must think of at least half a day before I can at all comprehend it. What? Engaged to her all the winter, before either of them came to Highbury? Engaged since October. Secretly engaged. It has hurt me, Emma, very much. It has hurt his father equally. Some part of his conduct we cannot excuse." Emma pondered a moment, and then replied, "I will not pretend not to understand you, and to give you all the relief in my power. Be assured that no such effect has followed his attentions to me as you are apprehensive of." Mrs. Weston looked up, afraid to believe, but Emma's countenance was as steady as her words. "That you may have less difficulty in believing this boast of my present perfect indifference," she continued, "I will farther tell you that there was a period in the early part of our acquaintance when I did like him, when I was very much disposed to be attached to him, nay, was attached, and how it came to cease is perhaps the wonder. Fortunately, however, it did cease. I have really for some time past, for at least these 3 months, cared nothing about him. You may believe me, Mrs. Weston. This is the simple truth." Mrs. Weston kissed her with tears of joy. "Mr. Weston will be almost as much relieved as myself," said she. "On this point we have been wretched. It was our darling wish that you might be attached to each other, and we were persuaded that it was so. Imagine what we have been feeling on your account." Emma answered, "How could he tell what mischief he might be doing? How could he tell that he might not be making me in love with him? Very wrong indeed." "From something that he said, my dear Emma, I rather imagine—" "Good God!" cried Emma, not attending to her. "Mrs. Smallridge, too! Jane actually on the point of going as governess! What could he mean by such horrible indelicacy? To suffer her to engage herself, to suffer her even to think of such a measure!" "He knew nothing about it, Emma. On this article I can fully acquit him. It was a private resolution of hers, not communicated to him. Till yesterday I know he said he was in the dark as to her plans. They burst on him, I do not know how, but by some letter or message, and it was the discovery of what she was doing, of this very project of hers, which determined him to come forward at once, own it all to his uncle, throw himself on his kindness, and, in short, put an end to the miserable state of concealment that had been carrying on so long." Emma began to listen better. "Well, and how did Mr. Churchill take it?" "Oh, most favourable for his nephew, gave his consent with scarcely a difficulty." "Ah," thought Emma, "he would have done as much for Harriet." At this moment Mr. Weston appeared at a little distance from the window, evidently on the watch. His wife gave him a look which invited him in, and while he was coming round, added, "Now, dearest Emma, let me entreat you to say and look everything that may set his heart at ease, and incline him to be satisfied with the match. Let us make the best of it, and indeed almost everything may be fairly said in her favour." Emma met Mr. Weston on his entrance with a smiling countenance, exclaiming, "I congratulate you, Mr. Weston, with all my heart, on the prospect of having one of the most lovely and accomplished young women in England for your daughter." There were many explanations to follow. Frank's folly in trying to cover their true relationship, which during Mrs. Churchill's life had to be secret, by flirtations with another, the misery and doubt which had driven Jane to break her engagement and accept a situation as a governess, the subsequent change in their affairs, the prospect of future happiness opening before them. Even the mystery of the pianoforte was made plain, for its choice and purchase was discovered to be the true reason for Frank Churchill's determination to have his hair cut in London. Emma returned home, still marvelling.
"Well, Miss Woodhouse," cried Harriet, coming eagerly into the room, "is it not the oddest news that ever was?"
"What news do you mean?" replied Emma, unable to guess by look or voice whether Harriet could indeed have received any hint.
"About Jane Fairfax. Did you ever hear anything so strange? Oh, you need not be afraid of owning it to me, for Mr. Weston told me himself. I met him just now."
"What did Mr. Weston tell you?" said Emma, still perplexed.
"Oh, he told me all about it, that Jane Fairfax and Mr. Frank Churchill are to be married, and that they have been privately engaged to one another this long while. How very odd!"
"I am delighted to hear you speak so stoutly on the subject," replied Emma, smiling. "But you do not mean to deny that there was a time, and not very distant either, when you gave me reason to understand that you did care about him."
"Him? Never, never! Dear Miss Woodhouse, how could you so mistake me?"
"Harriet," cried Emma after a moment's pause, "what do you mean? Good heaven, what do you mean? Mistake you? Am I to suppose, then—" She could not speak another word. Her voice was lost, and she sat down, waiting in great terror till Harriet should answer. Harriet, who was standing at some distance, and with face turned from her, did not immediately say anything, and when she did speak, it was in a voice nearly as agitated as Emma's.
"I should not have thought it possible," she began, "that you could have misunderstood me. I know we agreed never to name him, but consider how infinitely superior he is to everybody else. I should not have thought it possible that I should be supposed to mean any other person."
"Harriet," cried Emma, collecting herself resolutely, "let us understand each other now, without the possibility of farther mistake. Are you speaking of Mr. Knightley?"
"To be sure I am. I never could have an idea of anybody else, and so I thought you knew."
"Not quite," returned Emma with forced calmness, "for all that you then said appeared to me to relate to a different person."
"No, I was thinking of Mr. Knightley's coming and asking me to dance, when Mr. Elton would not stand up with me, and when there was no other partner in the room. That was the kind action, that was the noble benevolence and generosity, that was the service which made me begin to feel how superior he was to every other being upon earth."
Harriet was standing at one of the windows. Emma turned round to look at her in consternation, and hastily said, "Have you any idea of Mr. Knightley's returning your affection?"
"Yes," replied Harriet, "I must say that I have."
Emma's eyes were instantly withdrawn, and she sat silently meditating in a fixed attitude for a few minutes. A few minutes were sufficient for making her acquainted with her own heart. A mind like hers, once opening to suspicion, made rapid progress. She admitted, she acknowledged the whole truth. Why was it so much worse that Harriet should be in love with Mr. Knightley than with Frank Churchill? Why was the evil so dreadfully increased by Harriet's having some hope of a return? It darted through her with the speed of an arrow that Mr. Knightley must marry no one but herself. Some portion of respect for herself, however, gave Emma the resolution to sit and endure further with calmness, with even apparent kindness. Rousing from reflection, therefore, and subduing her emotion, she turned to Harriet again, and in a more inviting accent renewed the conversation. Harriet had been conscious of a difference in his behaviour ever since those 2 decisive dances. Emma knew that he had, on that occasion, found her much superior to his expectation. From that evening, Harriet had begun to be sensible of his talking to her much more than he had been used to do, and of his having indeed quite a different manner towards her, a manner of kindness and sweetness. Latterly she had been more and more aware of it. He seemed to want to be acquainted with her. Emma knew it to have been very much the case. She had often observed the change to almost the same extent, and many bitter feelings made the utmost exertion necessary on her side to enable her to say, "Harriet, I will only venture to declare that Mr. Knightley is the last man in the world who would intentionally give any woman the idea of his feeling for her more than he really does." Harriet seemed ready to worship her friend for a sentence so satisfactory. But the moment she was gone, this was the spontaneous burst of Emma's feelings. "Oh, God, that I had never seen her!" Till now that she was threatened with its loss, Emma had never known how much of her happiness depended on being first with Mr. Knightley, and only in the dread of being supplanted found how inexpressibly important it had been. It must be her ardent wish that Harriet might be disappointed, and she hoped that when able to see them together again, she might at least be able to ascertain what the chances for it were. The evening of this day was very long and melancholy, The weather added what it could of gloom, and continued much the same all the following morning. But in the afternoon it cleared. The wind changed into a softer quarter. The clouds were carried off. The sun appeared. It was summer again. With all the eagerness which such a transition gives, Emma resolved to be out of doors as soon as possible. Never had the exquisite sight, smell, sensation of nature, tranquil, warm, and brilliant after a storm, been more attractive to her. She longed for the serenity they might gradually introduce, and she lost no time in hurrying into the shrubbery. There, with spirits freshened and thoughts a little relieved, she had taken a few turns when she saw Mr. Knightley passing through the garden door and coming towards her. It was the first intimation of his being returned from London. She had been thinking of him the moment before as unquestionably 16 miles distant. They walked together. He was silent. She resolved, and trying to smile, began, "You have some news to hear, now you are come back, that will rather surprise you."
"Have I?"
said he quietly, and looking at her.
"Of what nature?"
"Oh, the best nature in the world. A wedding."
"If you mean Miss Fairfax and Frank Churchill, I have heard that already."
"Then you probably have been less surprised than any of us, for you have had your suspicions. I have not forgotten that you once tried to give me a caution. I wish I had attended to it, but I seem to have been doomed to blindness." For a moment or two nothing was said, and she was unsuspicious of having excited any particular interest, till she found her arm drawn within his and pressed against his heart, and heard him thus saying, in a tone of great sensibility, speaking low, "Time, my dearest Emma, time will heal the wound. Your own excellent sense. Accept my feelings of the warmest friendship. Abominable scoundrel, he will soon be gone. They will soon be in Yorkshire. I am sorry for her. She deserves a better fate." As soon as Emma could recover from the flutter of pleasure excited by such tender consideration, she replied, "You are very kind, but you are mistaken, and I must set you right. I am not in want of that sort of compassion. I have as much reason to be ashamed of confessing that I have never been at all attached to the person we are speaking of, as it might be natural for a woman to feel in confessing exactly the reverse, but I never have. I have very little to say for my own conduct. I was tempted by his attentions, and allowed myself to appear pleased." She had hoped for an answer here. At last, and tolerably in his usual tone, he said,
"I have never had a high opinion of Frank Churchill. I suppose, however, that I may have underrated him, and even if I have not underrated him hitherto, he may yet turn out well. With such a woman he has a chance. I have no motive for wishing him ill, and for her sake, whose happiness will be involved in his good character and conduct, I shall certainly wish him well."
"I have no doubt of their being happy together," said Emma. "I believe them to be very mutually and very sincerely attached."
"He is a most fortunate man," returned Mr. Knightley. "Everything turns out for his good. He has used everybody ill, and they are all delighted to forgive him. He is a fortunate man indeed."
"You speak as if you envied him."
"And I do envy him, Emma. In one respect he is the object of my envy."
Emma could say no more. They seemed to be within half a sentence of Harriet, and her immediate feeling was to avert the subject if possible.
"You will not ask me what is the point of envy. You are determined, I see, to have no curiosity. Emma, I must tell you what you will not ask, though I may wish it unsaid the next moment."
"No," replied Emma, quite confirmed by the depressed manner in which he still spoke. "But if you have any wish to speak openly to me as a friend—"
"As a friend," repeated Mr. Knightley. "Emma, that I fear is a word. No, I have no wish. Stay. Yes, why should I hesitate? I have gone too far already for concealment." "My dearest Emma," said he, "for dearest you will always be, whatever the event of this hour's conversation. My dearest, most beloved Emma, tell me at once, Say no if it is to be said."
She could really say nothing.
"You are silent," he cried. "Absolutely silent. At present I ask no more."
Emma was almost ready to sink under the agitation of this moment. The dread of being awakened from the happiest dream was perhaps the most prominent feeling.
"I cannot make speeches, Emma," he soon resumed. "If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more. But you know what I am. You hear nothing but truth from me. I have blamed you and lectured you, and you have borne it as no other woman in England would have borne it. Bear with the truths I would tell you now, dearest Emma, as well as you have borne with them. The manner, perhaps, may have as little to recommend them. God knows I have been a very indifferent lover, but you understand me. Yes, you see, you understand my feelings, and will return them if you can. At present I ask only to hear, once to hear your voice."
While he spoke, Emma's mind was most busy, and with all the wonderful velocity of thought, had been able to catch and comprehend the exact truth of the whole. She spoke then, on being so entreated. What did she say? Just what she ought, of course. A lady always does. She said enough to show that there need not be despair, and to invite him to say more himself. He had despaired at one period. The superior hopes which gradually opened were so much the more enchanting. The affection which he had been asking to be allowed to create if he could was already his. Within half an hour he had passed from a thoroughly distressed state of mind to something so like perfect happiness that it could bear no other name. Her change was equal. This 1/2 hour had given to each the same precious certainty of being beloved, had cleared from each the same degree of ignorance, jealousy, or distrust. On his side there had been long-standing jealousy. He had been in love with Emma and jealous of Frank Churchill from about the same period, one sentiment having probably enlightened him as to the other. What totally different feelings did Emma take back into the house from what she had brought out? She had then been only daring to hope for a little respite of suffering. She was now in an exquisite flutter of happiness, and such happiness, moreover, as she believed must still be greater when the flutter should have passed away. And in the course of the sleepless night, which was the tax for such an evening, she found one or two such very serious points to consider as made her feel that even her happiness must have some alloy. Her father and Harriet. She could only resolve at last that it would be inexpressibly desirable to have Harriet removed just now for a time from Highbury, and, indulging in one scheme more, nearly resolved that it might be practicable to get an invitation for her to Brunswick Square. Isabella had been pleased with Harriet, and a few weeks spent in London must give her some amusement. In time, of course, Mr. Knightley would be forgotten, that is, supplanted. But this could not be expected to happen very early, and it was really too much to hope, even of Harriet, that she could be in love with more than 3 men in 1 year. She had no difficulty in procuring Isabella's invitation, and she was fortunate in having a sufficient reason for asking it. There was a tooth amiss. Harriet had wished some time to consult a dentist. It was all arranged, and Harriet was safe in Brunswick Square. Now Emma could indeed enjoy Mr. Knightley's visits. Now she could talk, and she could listen with true happiness. Even the difficulty of Mr. Woodhouse's comfort was soon settled. Instead of Emma's removal to Donwell, Mr. Knightley was to be received at Hartfield, a change that could only add to his comfort, and one which inclined her father to contemplate the marriage with resignation. Time passed on. A few more tomorrows, and the party from London would be arriving. Emma was thinking of it one morning when Mr. Knightley came in. After the first chat of pleasure, he was silent, and then, in a graver tone, began with, "I have something to tell you, Emma. Some news." "Good or bad?" said she, quickly looking up in his face. "I do not know which it ought to be called." "Oh, good, I'm sure. I see it in your countenance. You're trying not to smile." "Does nothing occur to you? Do not you recollect Harriet Smith?" Her cheeks flushed at the name, and she felt afraid of something, though she knew not what.
"You are prepared for the worst, I see. Harriet Smith marries Robert Martin."
"Good God!" she cried. "Well!" Then, having recourse to her work-basket, in excuse for leaning down her face, and concealing all the exquisite feelings of delight and entertainment which she knew she must be expressing, she added, "Well now, tell me everything. Make this intelligible to me. How, where, when? Let me know it all. I never was more surprised. But it does not make me unhappy, I assure you. How has it been possible?"
"It is a very simple story. He went to town on business 3 days ago, and I got him to take charge of some papers which I was wanting to send to John. He found an opportunity of speaking to Harriet, and certainly did not speak in vain."
The joy, the gratitude, the exquisite delight of Emma's sensations may be imagined. The sole grievance and alloy thus removed in the prospect of Harriet's welfare, she was really in danger of becoming too happy for security. What had she to wish for? Before the end of September, Emma attended Harriet to church, and saw her hand bestowed on Robert Martin with so complete a satisfaction as no remembrances could impair. Robert Martin and Harriet Smith, the latest couple engaged of the three, were the first to be married. Jane Fairfax had already quitted Highbury, and was restored to the comforts of her beloved home with the Campbells. The Mr. Churchills were also in town, and they were only waiting for November. Mr. Elton was called upon, within a month from the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Martin, to join the hands of Mr. Knightley and Miss Woodhouse. Their wedding was very much like other weddings, where the parties have no taste for finery or parade, and Mrs. Elton thought it all extremely shabby and very inferior to her own. Very little white satin, very few lace veils, a most pitiful business. But, in spite of these deficiencies, the wishes, the hopes, the confidence, the predictions of the small band of true friends who witnessed the ceremony were fully answered in the perfect happiness of the union.